Did Robin Hood really exist? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes to life, and every video immerses you in the destinies of those who have shaped the world. Today, get ready to step into the misty depths of a forest, where the echoes of legends still linger. Among the ancient trees, the ruined abbeys, and the castles hidden in the English hills, a name has traversed the centuries like a wind of revolt: Robin Hood. Hero of the oppressed, thief from the rich, infallible archer, he has haunted popular stories for generations. Accompanied by his loyal companions and hunted by the Sheriff of Nottingham, he symbolizes the fight against injustice and the hope of the people. But behind the legend, one question remains. Did Robin Hood really exist? Was he a disgraced knight, an outlaw turned myth, or just a reflection of the dreams of a voiceless people? But before embarking on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss anything. Thank you and enjoy your journey. Since the end of the 12th century, the world has found itself on the brink of a period of profound upheaval. Between 1180 and 1230, various continents witnessed the emergence or collapse of empires, kingdoms, and increasingly dense trade networks. Dynastic rivalries intensified in Europe, while in the Near East, the Third Crusade transformed the political balance. The Byzantine Empire gradually weakened, Islamic power evolved around the Ayyubid Sultanate, and further east, Song Dynasty China reached a new golden age, soon threatened by the rising power of the Mongols under Temujin, the future Genghis Khan. In Africa, the beginnings of the Mali Empire heralded a new era of economic expansion, while in America, the post-Toltec transition paved the way for the later Aztec and Maya cultures. In this vast tapestry, even distant regions of Oceania and the Viking outposts in Greenland were integrated into a context of exchanges and discoveries. The era was not only marked by conflicts and crusades, but also by the circulation of knowledge, goods, and ideas, creating a true global web from which no legend, not even that of Robin Hood, can be excluded. The feudal system in Western Europe, at the turn of the 12th and 13th centuries, reached its full maturity. This means that a firmly established hierarchy connected the king to his vassals, then to the sub-vassals, and so on, down to the most modest lords. At the base of this pyramid were the peasants, mostly serfs, subject to dues and labor obligations toward their lords. At the top were the kings, whose authority was certainly greater than that of the great nobles, but who still had to deal with a powerful nobility ready to rebel if their privileges were threatened. In this context, loyalty was traded for lands, called fiefs, over which the local lord had jurisdiction. Personal ties predominated, and justice remained largely private, administered by barons who ensured order in their domain. The prince-bishops and large abbeys also increased their influence, supporting or challenging the secular princes depending on the circumstances. In England, the House of Plantagenet had been reigning since the mid-12th century. Henry II, crowned in 1154, consolidated his possessions, which extended from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees, thanks to his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Through this union, he combined the crown of England with a vast part of southwestern France. Among the Capetians in France, Philip II Augustus aimed to reconquer these territories by exploiting the internal dissensions of the Plantagenet family. The two lineages disputed Normandy, Anjou, and Poitou, entering into a long succession of conflicts involving dynastic intrigues and vassal alliances. By the end of the 12th century, hostility led to multiple military campaigns, while the peasant class and the bourgeoisie bore the fiscal weight of this rivalry. The Plantagenets of Angevin origin were sometimes referred to as Angevins in France, thus reflecting the interwoven regional designations and royal powers. In the Italian peninsula, the political landscape is fragmented into multiple city-states: Venice, Genoa, Pisa, Florence, Milan. These communes are experiencing exceptional commercial and financial growth, taking advantage of their strategic position at the crossroads of Mediterranean routes. They gradually emancipate themselves from imperial authority, the Holy Roman Empire or papal authority, by developing autonomous institutions and ensuring their own defense. In exchange for commercial privileges, they sign treaties with maritime powers and become heavily involved in supplying the Crusader states in the Holy Land. Venice, in particular, invests in shipbuilding and remains faithful to its own diplomatic interests, negotiating in turn with both Christian and Muslim princes. This rise of the Italian communes transforms the European balance of power by introducing a new form of urban power, based not on feudalism, but on economic activity and control of trade networks. In 1187, the reconquest of Jerusalem by Sultan Saladin, leader of the Ayyubid dynasty, shocks the entire Christian West. The loss of the Holy City, which had been conquered in 1099 by the Crusaders, prompts the Pope to call for a new armed expedition, the Third Crusade, 1189-1192. Three great sovereigns take the cross: the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who dies en route in the waters of Asia Minor, the King of France, Philip II Augustus, and the King of England, Richard the Lionheart. The Crusaders managed to retake Acre in 1191 and impose several agreements on Saladin, establishing pilgrimage corridors for Christians. However, Jerusalem remains under Muslim control. From then on, diplomatic relations evolve towards compromise. Richard and Saladin exchange gifts, hinting at the possibility of a more lasting, peaceful settlement, even though military tension does not entirely disappear. The Latin states of the East, notably the Kingdom of Jerusalem reduced to the coast, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli, survive with difficulty. They retreat behind imposing fortresses, such as the Crac des Chevaliers held by the Hospitallers, or the Castle of Beaufort in present-day southern Lebanon. Despite the initial shock, commercial contacts persist between the Western Mediterranean and Muslim ports. Genoese, Pisan, or Venetian merchants continue to negotiate with Sudanese, Egyptian, and Syrian ports, supplying Europe with spices, silks, and other luxury goods. To secure these exchanges, temporary truces are established, sometimes in the form of agreements negotiated directly between Crusader lords, Italian cities, and the Ayyubid administration. This phenomenon indicates a gradual realization that all-out war would jeopardize the prosperity of several coastal regions dependent on Mediterranean trade flows. The glory days of the Crusader ideal, symbolized by the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, fade as money, diplomacy, and the necessity of coexistence impose themselves in this zone, triangulated between the West, Byzantium, and the Muslim world. In the second half of the 12th century, the Byzantine Empire remains a major player in Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean basin. As the direct heir of the Eastern Roman Empire, it has preserved a flourishing Greek culture and a strong Orthodox Christianity. Constantinople, situated at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, remains a metropolis of primary importance, renowned for its arts, wealth, and immense palaces adorned with mosaics. However, since the fall of the Komnenian dynasty, imperial stability has been wavering. Internal tensions, rivalries for the throne, and the pressure of external forces, Norman Sicily, Slavs, Seljuk Turks, undermine the territory's cohesion. At the turn of the 13th century, a decisive turning point occurs, the Fourth Crusade, 1202-1204. Officially, it is meant to assist the Latin states of the East by striking Egypt, the economic and military heart of the Ayyubid Sultanate. However, the Venetians, who provide the transport ships, redirect the expedition towards Constantinople. Taking advantage of Byzantine dynastic quarrels, the Crusaders sacked the city in April 1204. The extent of the looting and destruction shocks even contemporary observers. Millennia-old churches are devastated. Numerous treasures of Orthodox Christian art disappear or are taken to the West. Following this tragedy, the Latin Empire of Constantinople was born, established by the Crusader leaders and dominated by the Flemish noble Baldwin of Flanders, Baldwin I of Constantinople. Byzantium then fragmented into several independent Greek states, the Empire of Nicaea, the Despotate of Epirus, and the Empire of Trebizond, all seeking to restore Byzantine authority and reclaim the imperial city. This fragmentation, which lasted until 1261, accelerated the decline of Byzantine power, once a solid Christian bulwark against Muslim expansion in Anatolia. Henceforth, exchanges between the East and the West were also conducted through the new Latin masters, including the Venetians, who took advantage of their maritime hegemony to strengthen their position in the Aegean Sea. In the Eastern Islamic world, the last third of the 12th century and the beginning of the 13th century were marked by the preeminence of the Ayyubid dynasty, founded by Saladin. After ending the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt in 1171, Saladin unified the Levant, Egypt, and part of the Arabian Peninsula, consolidating a power based both on Sunni legitimacy and the military efficiency of the armies. The Ayyubids governed from Cairo and Damascus, sometimes competing with the remnants of Seljuk power in eastern Anatolia and Mesopotamia. However, upon Saladin's death in 1193, the Sultanate underwent progressive fragmentation as sons, nephews, and other relatives fought over provinces and fortresses, weakening the initial unity. Meanwhile, the Seljuk Empire, which had dominated the Near East and Anatolia in the 11th century, was now just a mosaic of small autonomous sultanates or emirates. The Sultanate of Rum in Anatolia, with its capital in Konya, was the most visible branch of this heritage. Its dominance was threatened both by residual Byzantine pressure in the west and the emergence of new Mongol forces in the east. In the heart of Mesopotamia, the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad maintained an essentially spiritual power since the Turkish and Ayyubid takeover, but remained influential through its cultural and religious prominence. Baghdad remained a scientific and intellectual hub, heir to the prestigious House of Wisdom, founded 2 centuries earlier. The great scholars of the time continued to study mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, while translating Greek and Persian works. This accumulation of knowledge was not isolated, as Muslim scholars exchanged treatises with Jewish and Christian scholars, particularly in contact zones like Andalusia or Antioch. There was a cultural flourishing, sometimes interrupted by wars of succession, but largely driven by a desire to transmit and perfect knowledge in the service of sovereigns.
So what's your conviction? What is your truth? What's your prediction?
In East Asia, China was governed by the Song dynasty, which had lost the northern territory to a dynasty of Jurchen origin, the Jin. After 1127, the Song rulers consolidated their power in the south at Lin'an, today Hangzhou. This period, known as the Southern Song, was a time of remarkable advances in commerce, culture, and technology. Shipyards along the Yangtze gained an international reputation, producing junks capable of long voyages to India and Southeast Asia. Woodblock printing techniques were perfected, and the dissemination of books intensified. The state established a meritocratic bureaucracy, accessible through imperial examinations, leading to intellectual effervescence in Neo-Confucian philosophy. Thinkers like Zhu Xi developed commentaries that would influence all of East Asia. The development of a rudimentary banking system based on monetary certificates facilitated long-distance trade, including with the Islamic world via the Silk Road and the maritime route through the Indian Ocean. To the north, the nomadic empires closely watched China. Within the Mongolian steppes, an increasingly influential leader emerges, Temujin, who will soon take the name Genghis Khan Chinggis Khan in Mongolian. Born around 1162, he manages to unify the once hostile and unstable Mongol clans through his strategic acumen and political skills. The Mongolian armies, mobile and well-organized, are distinguished by their formidable mounted archers. After conquering the tribal confederation of the Merkits and subjugating the Tatars, Temujin begins to set his sights on China and Central Asia. His authority is officially proclaimed in 1206 during a great Kurultai gathering on the banks of the Onon. From that date, the Mongol juggernaut starts moving, shaking the age-old balances of the steppes and threatening in turn the Jin Empire, controlling northern China and Khwarezm, in what is now Uzbekistan, Iran, and Turkmenistan. These initial assaults do not always result in immediate conquests, but the Mongolian machine is in place. It will eventually extend its grip over the majority of Eurasia, thus connecting Europe to the Chinese world in an unprecedented way. In sub-Saharan Africa, at the turn of the 12th and 13th centuries, the great power remains the Ghana Empire, although it is already in decline. In the region situated between the Sahara and the savannas, the emergence of new kingdoms is observed, whose rise relies on the control of the gold and salt trade, transported across the desert by camel caravans. It is in this context that the birth of the Mali Empire is being prepared. According to oral tradition, it is under the impetus of the legendary Sundiata Keita in the early 13th century that the Mandinka clans gradually unify the scattered cities and territories in the Upper Niger area. The griots, storytellers and poets, perpetuate the memory of founding episodes like the Battle of Kirina around 1235, where Sundiata is said to have defeated the king of Soso. While these events occur slightly after 1230, the preceding decades play a crucial role in political gestation and cultural affirmation. Control of the trans-Saharan trade routes, particularly towards the Maghreb and Egypt, enables the future rulers of Mali to enrich themselves through the export of gold extracted in the Bambouk region, and later in that of Boer. The arrival of Muslim traders fosters the progressive Islamization of the local aristocracy, creating religious and commercial links with the great cities of the Islamic world, such as Tunis, Cairo, and Fez. North of the Sahara, the Berber dynasties, the Almoravids, and then the Almohads, control and relay part of this traffic, facilitating the transit of textiles, salt, horses, luxury items, and slaves. In return, African sultans develop lavish courts, support scholars and poets, and dedicate part of their wealth to the foundation of mosques. The cities of Djenné and Timbuktu stand out in this landscape by becoming, from the 13th century, important intellectual and commercial hubs. This system of exchanges thus links West Africa to the Mediterranean world, already demonstrating the globalized nature of the era's strategic resources. In pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, the Toltec heritage centered on the city of Tulao-Tolan, in the current state of Hidalgo, Mexico, had shown between the 10th and 12th centuries. The artistic and religious influence of the Toltecs marked the region, particularly through the cult of the god Quetzalcoatl, represented in the form of a feathered serpent. At the turn of the 12th and 13th centuries, Toltec power had already disintegrated, giving way to competing city-states. Some populations migrate, pushing ever further into the center or south, while others remain in the former Toltec areas, perpetuating local cultural practices. Gradually, the future Mexica's Aztecs begin their long march towards the Valley of Mexico, where they will establish the famous Tenochtitlan at the beginning of the 14th century. Archaeological and epigraphic documents and later accounts suggest that recurrent conflicts agitate the Anahuac Basin of Mexico, allowing the rise of new lineages that present themselves as heirs or continuators of Toltec prestige. Further south, in the regions of the Yucatan, the highlands of Guatemala and Chiapas, the Maya civilization has already gone through its golden age, the classic period between the 3rd and 9th centuries. We witness a fragmentation into rival cities such as Chichen Itza, Mayapan, or Uxmal, forming a post-classic ensemble that is less monumental compared to the previous period, but still vibrant. Several cities continue astronomical predictions and constructions of religious buildings while redefining their alliances. The trade of cacao, salt, cotton, and quetzal feathers flows between these entities, while exotic goods, such as possible pearls or metal objects, arrive from further afield, evidence of long-distance exchanges. On the fringes of the lowlands, or in the Petén area, more isolated communities still maintain a traditional way of life. The whole of Mesoamerica is thus in full reconfiguration, creating complex relationships between the expanding Nahua world and a Maya tradition that adapts to new socio-political realities. In the Andes, the Inca Empire has not yet been formed. It will emerge in the 15th century, and there is an array of kingdoms and chiefdoms dividing the high plateaus and valleys. The Chachapoyas, Chimu, and other smaller entities develop, each having its own architectural features, beliefs, and exchange networks. The fortified city of Cuelap, built by the Chachapoyas in the northern Andes of Peru, testifies to complex craftsmanship. On the northern coast of Peru, the Chimu civilization is organized around Chanchan, one of the largest cities on the continent. Contacts between these Andean societies in Mesoamerica remain limited by the topography and the absence of large draft animals. Nevertheless, the circulation of objects, such as spondylus shells from the Pacific, hints at long-distance exchange along the coastal routes. Pre-Columbian civilizations of this period, although isolated from the Eurasian perspective, evolve within an active regional network, with logics of conquest, religious syncretism, and artistic innovation. In the Pacific, Polynesian, Melanesian, and Micronesian populations continue migrations, navigations, and insular exchanges. Polynesians established in the Hawaiian Islands, Tahiti, the Samoa archipelago, and as far as New Zealand, where the Maori have settled since around the 10th century, adapt to local environments by developing various cultures, incorporating taro tubers, banana plants, and fishing practices. The lack of written documents from these societies makes it more challenging to reconstruct their history at this time, but oral traditions and archaeological analyses indicate internal political dynamics, with the formation of more or less centralized chiefdoms depending on the islands. Polynesian canoes, designed to withstand long ocean crossings, continue inter-island routes, allowing the circulation of ritual objects, foodstuffs, and agricultural techniques. Some regions, like Rapa Nui, the Easter Island, move towards a marked cultural specialization with the construction of the famous monumental statues, the moai. At the other end of the planet, in the North Atlantic, the Vikings established colonies in Greenland from the end of the 10th century. Under the leadership of Eric the Red and his descendants, two main colonies, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, anchored themselves in the southern fjords of Greenland. They depended on Iceland and the Kingdom of Norway, but maintained a semi-autonomous community organization based on farming and hunting. The settlers raised sheep, goats, and cattle in these Arctic pastures, while also engaging in fishing and hunting seals and walruses. Walrus tusks were highly sought after in Europe as a luxury material for ivory carving. Ships called nær ensured connections with Iceland, the British Isles, and Scandinavia, transporting hides, ivory, wool, as well as wood and metal necessary for the settlers. During the period 1180–1230, the Greenlandic population endured increasingly harsh climate conditions. A slow cooling and persistent ice made navigation more difficult. Despite these challenges, the Nordic community tried to preserve its ties with Europe. Bishops were appointed to lead the Diocese of Gardar, while Norwegian merchants sought to maintain a monopoly on Greenland's export products. Icelandic sagas sporadically recount tales of voyages, exchanges, and even tensions with the Inuit populations, whom they called Skrælings. Shortly before 1230, the settlers were still unaware that their descendants would ultimately disappear in the 14th or 15th century, likely due to isolation, climate, and potential indigenous pressures. England at the end of the 12th century and the beginning of the 13th century is directly connected to the Norman conquest of 1066, which marked a major turning point in the kingdom's history. When William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, seized the English crown after his victory at the Battle of Hastings, he imposed a new ruling elite of Norman origin on England and deeply reorganized its political and legal institutions. The former Anglo-Saxon nobility was largely dispossessed of their lands, which were redistributed to barons from Normandy and northern France. This elite, bound to the crown by an oath of loyalty, consolidated the feudal regime by taking effective control of most agricultural domains and fortified castles. Rapidly, a gradual fusion between Anglo-Saxon and Norman traditions was observed. The aristocracy spoke an oil dialect that would become Anglo-Norman and adopted highly structured feudal customs, while the vernacular language, English, continued to evolve under the influence of the new rulers. The descendants of these barons considered themselves as much Norman as English, though tensions were recurrent, especially regarding alliances and successions between both sides of the Channel. The feudal regime established after 1066 was eminently strict. The king relied on a pyramid of vassals and sub-vassals, a system in which each held lands in exchange for military services and dues. In this highly hierarchical society, all power emanated from the top. The king's royal rights included minting currency, levying taxes, and exercising supreme justice, while the barons and principal lords were entrusted with the responsibility of enforcing these rights on their own domains. Castles became centers of power and strategic control. The status of every free man or serf depended on his link to the land and military obligations. A knight, for example, swore to provide armed assistance whenever the king or his suzerain demanded it, which solidly structured the kingdom's army with heavy cavalry and a feudal framework. In this context, the common law gradually emerges, a unified set of case law rules developed in the royal courts. From the reign of Henry II in 1154, a system of itinerant courts dispatched by the crown to handle routine matters in the counties and verify on site the proper application of royal law begins to develop. The judges, often called justices, travel throughout the kingdom, gather testimonies, and arbitrate land or commercial disputes. This organization helps to alleviate the arbitrariness of seigneurial justice and simultaneously strengthens the king's authority. The decisions of these itinerant courts constitute a base of examples or precedents, which are used to resolve similar cases in the future. Over time, the common law thus acquires a certain institutional coherence, even though it still coexists with local customs stemming from Anglo-Saxon or Norman traditions. The assizes, that is to say, the formal sessions of justice, lead to meticulous records of crimes and misdemeanors, recorded in registers that form the embryo of the English judicial administration. Simultaneously, another element characterizes this feudal England, the system of royal forests. Partly inherited from the old Anglo-Saxon kings, it is largely perfected by the Norman sovereigns. The term forest implies not only a wooded area, but an exceptional legal status. It designates certain stretches of woods, plains, and sometimes even fields where the king holds special rights, particularly of hunting and justice. These forests often fall under a specialized office, the forestership, entrusted to royal officers whose mission is to preserve game, especially the deer, considered the noblest prey, and to punish firmly any poaching or encroachment. The sheriff, the local representative of royal power in the county, ensures the application of the forest laws and can organize patrols to track down offenders. Punishments for those who hunt illegally in the royal forests are severe, ranging from hefty fines to mutilation or even the death penalty, depending on the severity of the offense. This system, which highlights the king's exclusive privilege over the best hunting areas, arouses the anger of petty lords, farmers, and local inhabitants whose grazing and gathering liberties can be restricted. Even simple gathering of deadwood for heating can be strictly regulated under the pretext of protecting the fauna and, to a lesser extent, the flora. The figure of the sheriff, precisely, is unavoidable in the daily life of the population. The term, derived from the Anglo-Saxon shire reeve, meaning lord or administrator of the county, refers to the officer representing the king at the local level. Charged with collecting taxes, recruiting the militia, or the troops of the feudal host, but also delivering preliminary justice, the sheriff is at the heart of the administrative system. In regions housing a royal forest, he acts in concert with the forest officials, who also have specific prerogatives. The leniency or strictness of his rule application varies according to personality and economic conditions. Some sheriffs are described as greedy, imposing additional corvées or collecting exorbitant fees, while others strive to maintain order as fairly as possible, both to satisfy the king and to avoid peasant revolts. The English society of this era perfectly reflects the typical feudal structure of Western Europe at the turn of the 12th and 13th centuries, with several distinct categories. Knights form the backbone of the feudal army. Often from the lower nobility, they are in the direct service of barons or the king. A knight must finance his equipment, armor, steed, sword, and be ready to go to war or join a crusade. When not on a military campaign, these men live on their estates, managing their lands or serving as advisors in local administration. Some own just a manor and a few dozen hectares, while others have larger fiefs and maintain a suite of servants and squires. At the upper echelons of this hierarchy are the counts or dukes, whose local power is considerable. Below the knights are the vavassors and various free tenants, intermediaries in the land organization, sometimes tasked with supervising farm management and collecting dues. The status of serf is the most humble in this hierarchy. The man of servile condition is not free to move and owes the bulk of his work to his lord. In exchange for minimal protection and the right to cultivate a plot for their own subsistence, serfs provide agricultural labor, take care of raising livestock, and construct or maintain local infrastructure such as mills, barns, and roads. They cannot marry or inherit without the lord's permission, and their daily life is dictated by the demands of the manorial estate. Any transgression may result in a fine or more severe punishments. Despite this subordinate condition, some serfs attempt to gain their freedom by fleeing to free towns, or rarely by purchasing their manumission. The villages also include free peasants, sometimes smallholders, who rent their land under less burdensome conditions, or artisans who live from their craft. The clergy represents another pillar of the social structure. Abbots, parish priests, and bishops are everywhere linked to the seigneurial and royal administration. Large abbeys, such as those from the Benedictine or Cistercian orders, hold vast estates and sometimes establish true centers of learning. Parish churches serve as gathering points for the rural population, not only spiritually, but also for maintaining records of baptisms and marriages. Ecclesiastical revenues largely come from the tithe, a tax meant to finance the church and levied on crops or livestock. Religious dignitaries attend the king's councils and maintain their own networks of influence. Many clerics receive advanced training, which gives them the ability to draft and preserve documents and charters. It is in this capacity that they are often found serving in the royal chancery. Merchants, for their part, hold an increasingly significant position with the growth of trade exchanges. In towns with a charter of franchise, there are trade guilds, assemblies of merchants, or specialized artisans, weavers, tanners, blacksmiths, bakers, who enjoy certain privileges granted by the king or by a local lord. These privileges may include the right to freely conduct business, hold regular markets without excessive taxes, or self-administer by electing representatives such as borough bailiffs or mayors. These urban groups, gathered in fortified towns or situated near major river routes, play a growing role in the kingdom's economy. Despite high fiscal pressure, merchants can sometimes enrich themselves and rise to the rank of significant bourgeois, thus creating a reservoir of new forces in a system theoretically dominated by the landowning nobility. In the second half of the 12th century, England is governed by a dynasty stemming from the House of Plantagenet, one of whose founders is Henry II. He ascends to the throne in 1154 and reigns until 1189. His accession marks the consolidation of a vast array of territories, often called the Angevin Empire, which extends not only over England, but also over a large part of western France: Anjou, Normandy, Maine, Touraine, Aquitaine. In the feudal context of Western Europe, this extended territorial position grants Henry II considerable influence over political and economic stakes. He benefits from two major inheritances, that of his father, Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, and that of his mother, Empress Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England. This dual lineage allows him to claim both the English crown and significant counties and duchies on the continent. The relative instability of his predecessor, Stephen of Blois' reign, also helps him to establish himself as the legitimate sovereign and to assert his authority. In a kingdom where feudalism remains the main framework of the social structure, Henry II seeks to centralize power and modernize institutions. However, he inherits an England tested by the civil war of previous years. Barons have strengthened locally, seigneurial rights have become more complex, and the judicial system proves fragmented. Customs vary from one county to another, making justice inconsistent and difficult to apply. Deeply convinced of the necessity of a more unified royal authority, Henry II embarks on ambitious reforms that touch on the exercise of justice and revenue management. One of his first initiatives is to streamline the functioning of the royal court and to develop what will become the common law. To this end, he sends itinerant judges, often referred to as circuit justices, across the country to issue decisions in the king's name and ensure a certain legal uniformity in local courts. These reforms, while improving legal coherence and Henry II's authority, also place increased pressure on the more modest tenants. Before the institution of this new system, many territorial disputes or family disagreements were resolved at the seigneurial or communal level without real crown intervention. With the rise of common law and the dispatch of magistrates mandated by the king, a new, more costly judicial procedure emerges. Plaintiffs must pay certain fees to initiate lawsuits, to obtain royal writs, or even to appeal. This increase in costs heavily weighs on peasants and small landowners, who sometimes find themselves forced to sell properties or incur debt to defend their rights before the royal justice system. Nevertheless, Henry II is determined to maintain this policy as it enables him to strengthen his treasury and ensures greater consistency in the application of laws. Besides judicial centralization, Henry II innovates in tax administration. He introduces the notion of scutage, a tax that vassals must pay if they prefer to give money rather than serve militarily. At first glance, this mechanism seems to offer an attractive alternative to knights wishing to avoid a campaign, but it also has the effect of increasing the royal treasury. The lords often pass the burden onto their tenants, creating a chain of fiscal pressure that ultimately weighs on the humblest classes. Furthermore, Henry II imposes more fines for various forest offenses and poaching, notably in the royal forests, where deer hunting is strictly regulated. Peasants, sometimes forced to poach for food, then face severe penalties reinforced by the newly instituted legal apparatus. For common folk, these reforms might be seen as royal interference and a source of financial hardship. Despite these constraining measures, Henry II's reign is marked by a certain political and economic stability. The barons, even if they sometimes disapprove of Henry's authoritarianism, regularly ally with him to defend their continental possessions against the King of France. Henry II often finds himself in direct opposition with Louis VII, and later, at the end of his reign, with Philip Augustus. These Franco-English rivalries shape England's foreign policy and lay the foundation for future wars of conquest. But they also determine the monarch's fiscal choices, as he constantly needs funds to finance the defense or administration of his territories. In this context, the centralization of courts and the imposition of occasional or regular taxes are part of a broader plan aimed at maintaining the order and prosperity of the Plantagenet dynasty. When Henry II died in 1189, his son Richard, nicknamed the Lionheart, inherited the throne. Richard was already renowned for his warrior temperament and military ambitions. His attention quickly turned to the Holy Land as the Third Crusade was about to begin. His goal was clear: to retake Jerusalem, conquered by Sultan Saladin, and to strengthen the Christian presence in the Near East. From the beginning of his reign, Richard prepared to depart and mobilized considerable sums to finance this expedition. These preparations had a direct impact on taxation in England. To raise cavalry, arm ships, and maintain troops, the king increased taxes and demanded new payments from the clergy and nobility. He even went so far as to sell certain official positions, such as the title of sheriff or other charges, to bolster his crusade treasury. The most modest populations felt this pressure again, as lords passed the fiscal burden onto their estates, and the scarcity of cash in the countryside further aggravated the situation. Richard then embarked for the Near East, leaving behind an England administered by regents and advisors. His long absence allowed some barons and his brother, the future John Lackland, to maneuver to increase their influence. During the Crusade, Richard forged a reputation as a brave warrior, notably distinguishing himself during the capture of Acre in 1191. However, he failed to reconquer Jerusalem, primarily due to dissensions within the Crusader coalition and the fierce resistance of Saladin. On his return journey in 1192, Richard was captured near Vienna by Leopold of Austria, with whom he was in conflict. The king was handed over to the German Emperor Henry VI, who demanded a hefty ransom for his release. This ransom, estimated at 150,000 marks of silver, represented an astronomical sum for the kingdom. To gather the funds, exceptional taxes were multiplied. The people, clergy, and barons had to contribute, sometimes under threat of confiscation of property or sanctions. Richard's release, finally secured in 1194, left England financially drained and politically unstable. During Richard's captivity, John Lackland, the last surviving son of Henry II, schemed to seize power. Born in 1166, he had long been considered a younger son without a significant territorial future, hence his nickname, Lackland. While his older brothers inherited entire regions, Henry the Young received Normandy, Geoffrey received Brittany, and Richard received Aquitaine, John had limited prospects. When Richard departed on crusade, the temptation for him to take the throne was strong. Some barons supported his claims, either because they feared Richard's authoritarian return or because they had benefited from John's generosity during the legitimate king's absence. However, Richard's capture by the German emperor polarized the kingdom. Factions clashed, negotiated, and John attempted to assert his legitimacy as regent. Upon news of Richard's imminent release, John tried to maintain his position, but he found himself ultimately isolated when Richard returned in 1194. The king, although concerned about the kingdom's unity, did not forget his brother's betrayal. That said, financial and military needs forced him to temporarily tolerate the presence of hostile factions. Richard the Lionheart then resumed the head of the English government for a few more years until his premature death in 1199. Following a wound received during a siege in Limousin, he succumbed, leaving the English throne vacant once again. The logical choice then fell on John Lackland, despite his past. He was crowned King of England, but the stability of his reign was far from assured. From the beginning of his government, John faced several crises. The King of France, Philip Augustus, contested his legitimacy over certain continental territories. The English nobility, already strained by the previous reign's taxes, feared new fiscal measures. The clergy, for its part, maintained a conflicted relationship with the crown, notably concerning ecclesiastical investiture issues. John thus had to navigate these multiple tensions while seeking to consolidate his authority. At the turn of the 1200s, a series of failures on the continental scene further weakened John's position. He gradually lost Normandy in 1204, after failing to defend the duchy against the armies of Philip Augustus. This territorial loss was traumatic for the Norman nobility, who felt abandoned, and many of its members relocated to England. John, increasingly confined to his island, sought to replenish the state's coffers to finance his reconquest attempts. He imposed extraordinary tax levies and intensified feudal taxation, increased scutage, higher fines, and confiscations of property. He also used his royal judicial prerogative to sanction rebellious barons, or those he suspected of not being fully loyal to him. In a kingdom already exhausted by previous exactions, these practices provoked profound discontent. The great lords were all the more outraged, as feudal loyalty traditionally involved a balance. In exchange for their military and financial support, they expected protection and a form of respect for their privileges. The conflict between John and the nobility then spanned several years. In 1207, he disagreed with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. John refused to recognize the Pope's candidate, which led to his excommunication. England was placed under interdict in 1208. Sacraments could no longer be administered normally, causing great fear among the believing population. The break with Rome isolated John politically and fueled the anger of the great barons, who saw it as a sign of dangerous deviance by their sovereign. To reconcile with the Pope, John eventually relented in 1213. But the damage was done. The barons remained hostile, especially since the fiscal policy did not relent. During successive military expeditions against France, John suffered new defeats. The most resounding occurred in 1214 at Bouvines, near Lille, where he lost to the coalition forces of Philip Augustus and his allies. This military failure, combined with the loss of Normandy, crystallized the anger of the English nobility. From 1214, the barons intensified their demands. They required the king to abide by the old feudal customs and limit his fiscal demands. They demanded an end to arbitrary confiscations and more respectful treatment of their rights. Weakening, John tried to temporize, but his indecision only fueled tensions. Many baronial families, supported by part of the high clergy and some aldermen of major cities like London, formed an opposition league. Faced with the threat of civil war, the king had no choice but to negotiate. The spring of 1215 was marked by intense negotiations. The rebel barons organized militarily, while John hesitated between direct confrontation and partial concession of their demands. On June 15, 1215, a notable agreement was reached at Runnymede, near Windsor. John agreed to affix his seal to a text drafted to satisfy the barons' aspirations, the Magna Carta. Although this initial document was quickly annulled by Innocent III, who declared it illegitimate due to the pressure placed on the king, it remains a fundamental milestone in the history of law and liberties in England. The 1215 version itself contains 63 clauses covering various aspects: limitation of arbitrary tax levies, right to a fair trial, regulation of royal and feudal power. The barons see this text as a guarantee against authoritarianism, while many subjects view it as the possible end of the crown's absolute control over justice and taxation matters. Especially, the Magna Carta provides that a council of barons can rise against the king if he does not honor the agreed clauses. The reign of John, however, continues in a deleterious climate. Despite the signing of the Magna Carta, hostilities do not disappear. Certain barons, distrustful, doubt the sincerity of their sovereign. The rupture with Rome having been partially resolved, John tries to have the charter invalidated by the Pope, which immediately triggers the resumption of armed conflicts. The rebel barons even invite Prince Louis, son of the King of France, to take the English crown, prompting the arrival of a French army on English soil in 1216. John dies that very year as the Civil War reaches its peak. His son, Henry III, is only a few years old when he succeeds him, and the conflict continues until Henry III's regency negotiates a new version of the Magna Carta. At the end of the 12th century, medieval England sees the emergence of a multiplicity of administrative, legal, and sometimes literary writings that, for historians, serve as clues enabling the tracing of the evolution of popular legends. Among these sources, the pipe rolls occupy an essential place for the study of daily life and significant characters, real or supposed. The pipe rolls, also known as the Great Rolls of the Exchequer, are annual financial reports drafted by the royal administration to record taxes levied, debts settled, or fines imposed. They result from a fiscal system established after the Norman conquest of 1066, which enforces a rigorous oversight of the kingdom's income and expenditures. In 1203, one of these registers mentions a certain Robert Hod, applicant or debtor, details vary according to experts, whose presence in an official document intrigues. At the time, the name Robin already existed as a diminutive of Robert, and the surname Hod or Hood was not uncommon. However, when historians of later centuries reconstruct the chronology of famous outlaws, they wonder if this Robert Hod could be, if not the real Robin Hood, at least one of the many sources feeding this legendary figure. This entry in the pipe rolls of 1203 is not the only one to raise questions. Other occurrences, such as Robe Hod, Hob Hod, or Robert Hood, sporadically appear in various local archives, particularly under King John's reign in 1199, or in the early years of Henry III's reign, which began in 1216. However, the identity of these individuals remains enigmatic. They could be simple tenants, vagabonds, notorious thieves, or characters accused of various offenses. Researchers note that the transformation of a surname into a generic nickname qualifying a brigand might be the result of a phenomenon of social stigmatization, where Robin Hood becomes a common expression to designate an outlaw. In this perspective, recording a defaulting Robert Hod in the payment of a sum to the royal treasury is not enough to prove that he is the Robin Hood of the ballads. Nonetheless, it establishes a first textual milestone and a jar door towards the constitution of a legend or even an archetype. During the decades that follow, English documentation from the late 12th and early 13th centuries does not reveal a coherent narrative about an outlaw archer operating in the forests of Barnesdale or Sherwood. The few explicit references are rather the result of later cross-references, made when the figure of Robin Hood gradually spreads into the collective imagination. For the inhabitants of the time, the name is not unusual, but posterity will watch for any clue that could connect a real man to what one already senses as the beginnings of a semi-legendary narrative. In parallel, England experiences a period of feudal transformations, legislative reforms, and military expeditions that leave little room for popular written literature. Close to power, monastic chroniclers or court clerks focus on major events: the absence of King Richard the Lionheart during the Third Crusade, the quarrels between John Lackland and his nobility, or the baronial revolts leading to the Magna Carta. In this context, the trace of Robert Hod remains buried amid lists of debts and money to be recovered. It is a brief echo, a discrete starting point. Little by little, however, an oral tradition is taking root, which is going to gain momentum. From the end of the 13th century, and especially during the 14th, various anonymous ballads begin to circulate in taverns, on market squares, and during seasonal festivals. Minstrels, storytellers, and other troubadours, whether English but also Scots or even Welsh, sing heroic and entertaining stories. Among them are tales featuring a certain Robin Hood, a charismatic figure who stands up against injustice and who takes refuge, according to the versions, in two great forests: Sherwood, located north of Nottingham, and Barnesdale, further north still, in Yorkshire. The people, composed of freed serfs, increasingly influential merchants, small artisans, and clerks, distant from the central power, are enthralled by these stories. They evoke an atypical outlaw, defender of the weak, skilled archer, corrector of wrongs, who defies unjust authority embodied by tyrannical sheriffs. This orality, very vibrant in the Middle Ages, constitutes the fertile ground on which the legend develops. One of the major ballads of this nascent corpus, later known as a Jest of Robin Hood, does not appear in written form until the 15th century. However, there is little doubt that earlier versions were already circulating as early as the 14th century, and perhaps even before. In this collection of verse tales, we find foundational elements such as generosity towards the poor, hostility towards tax agents, brotherly complicity between Robin and his companions, as well as the notion of honor. Although the final text of A Jest of Robin Hood is likely a compilation of different ballads or fragments, its existence attests to the antiquity of the oral tradition. Medieval audiences are fond of stories where the little people take revenge on oppression, and these ballads help forge the archetypal image of a thief with a big heart. For today's international audience, it is essential to understand that this notoriety is not born ex nihilo. It relies on an unstable socio-political context and on the need of popular classes to project a dream of symbolic justice into their songs. It is also significant that many of these stories situate Robin's adventures at the border between two counties or two rival sheriffs, thus amplifying the idea of an elusive bandit, capable of playing with legal boundaries. Barnesdale, often mentioned, is located in the West Riding of Yorkshire region, not far from the major communication route from York to London, which makes plausible the escape and occasional attacks on convoys of wealthy merchants. Sherwood, the famous forest of Nottinghamshire, is furthermore closer to the city of Nottingham and its castle, where the sheriff resides. The ballads enjoy depicting Robin's sagacity, his ability to disappear into the wooded depths, and the solidarity of the outlaws in circumventing patrols. The Romanesque nature of these places already contributes to forging a collective memory. The forest becomes a timeless space, where the feudal order is playfully and subversively contested. The mode of transmission of these ballads in the Middle Ages relies largely on orality. The audience is not, for the most part, readers or scribes. The stories are sung more than they are read, and it is through the voices of minstrels and wandering storytellers that they come to life. The rare written traces, such as certain manuscripts, only reflect a portion of the diversity of versions circulating. In each performance, the storyteller adds, omits, or modifies details in order to better adapt to his audience, to the available melodies, or to the political issues of the moment. This narrative plasticity, typical of the era, explains the coexistence of many variants. For some, Robin is a yeoman, a free peasant skilled with the bow. For others, he is a fallen noble, seeking to reclaim his usurped lands. Some versions emphasize fiscal oppression more, others highlight martial prowess. Nevertheless, all these narrative threads converge towards a same rebellious identity, constructed in opposition to the feudal rigor deemed abusive. Furthermore, the rise of religious theater, notably in the form of mysteries, moralities, miracle plays, and other spectacles linked to the liturgical calendar, plays a surprising role in the spread of the legend. At first glance, the association between the figure of an outlaw and sacred dramaturgy may seem incongruous. Nevertheless, in the medieval context, many stage plays take place during movable feasts and processions, where they do not always limit themselves to the representation of strictly biblical stories. The May Games, a period of celebration of spring renewal, often feature parades where everyone dresses up, and themes of the countryside, allegories of fertility, and more broadly popular stagings are found. In this respect, some sources suggest that the figure of Robin Hood may have been integrated as a comedic or heroic character, blending pagan entertainment and collective piety. During the May Games, especially in certain English towns, It happens that an actor portrays a forest hero with a bow, tasked with animating the parade or escorting the May Queen. The association with fertility, nature, and the celebration of the spring cycle makes the character of Robin Hood perfectly suitable. He is linked both to the forest and to the idea of popular rejoicing. Gradually, this theatrical character, whose popularity grows with each performance, helps consolidate the image of a jovial Robin, protector of the weak, who opposes tyranny. Spectators, having attended these semi-religious, semi-profane performances, leave marked by the songs and stage intrigues, which they then recount in their rural or urban communities. Thus, religious theater and the popular May festivals become an additional vector for the diffusion of the legend, without the church necessarily seeing it as an act of protest. It is rather a festive tradition that incorporates characters from the collective imagination, of which Robin Hood is just one example among others. The links between these festivities and the orality of ballads are woven over the decades. Minstrels can adapt their songs to accompany the skits performed on church parvises or public squares. Similarly, actors sometimes improvise scenes with social justice accents, where the forest hero helps a poor monk or confounds a greedy wealthy merchant. The people, fond of such role reversals, applaud and then incorporate the story's key phrases into their daily discourse. Thus, the entertaining function of the May Games is coupled with a subversive potential. Through disguise and the carnivalesque spirit, social hierarchies temporarily blur, and everyone can identify with an ephemeral freedom or a discreet denunciation of abuses. The outlaw archer lends himself particularly well to this role, as he symbolizes a form of joyful disobedience born at the very heart of medieval society, drawing on existing religious and communal values. For proponents of a rigid hierarchical order, the proliferation of these popular spectacles and songs of Robin Hood might seem worrisome. Some lords or royal officials are concerned to see an outlaw glorified, even within the context of a simple celebration. The church, for its part, takes a more nuanced approach. While it monitors excesses, it often tolerates these moments of gathering that contribute to social cohesion. Moreover, the religious infusing of the Middle Ages is such that any festive event, even profane, carries within it a spiritual dimension that tempers criticism of the established order. Thus, the character of Robin Hood does not become an openly contentious political agitator, but rather a narrative symbol of the desire for justice rooted in the collective conscience. Over time, the fascination with the outlaw only grows, especially in rural areas affected by tax pressure and in free towns seeking more municipal autonomy. The popularization through celebration and theater also sheds light on how myths are born and take root. Long before the printing press, the fact that several sources, administrative registers, semi-religious plays, oral ballads, converge on the same protagonist suggests that a process of mythification is at work. The absence of centralized control over these sources, combined with the high mobility of storytellers and pilgrims, ensures the dissemination of the story. In the parishes, you can hear versions that emphasize the solidarity between Robin and the poor priests. In the castles, a version is told where Robin betrays corrupt barons. May games and other festive performances mix these variations, redistribute them, and each spectator leaves with a fragment of the legend to transmit in turn. Therefore, one cannot precisely date the birth of the myth, but as early as the end of the 13th century, one can observe the gradual formation of folklore centered around common values: cunning, boldness, generosity, moderate anti-clericalism, especially against the opulence of certain prelates, and the desire to live freely under the canopy of large woods. The manuscript of what would become a Jest of Robin Hood, probably compiled at the very beginning of the 15th century, associates several of these earlier ballads into a continuous sequence. It contains episodes illustrating Robin's benevolence towards the humble and travelers, the usual confrontation with corrupt feudal authorities, and the sacred dimension of certain acts of charity. The language used, more classical, already attests to a fixation of the legend beyond mere improvisation. Sometimes, the stanzas mimic the structure of popular rhymes, easy to remember, encouraging the audience to participate in the singing. The emergence of a written version then helps to spread the story among a public that begins to become literate, notably in merchant circles. Collections of ballads gradually become fashionable. Even if most peasants do not read, there exists a handful of individuals, notaries, lay scribes, wealthy bourgeois, who maintain a taste for these texts. Thus, the legend of Robin Hood slowly enters the documented sphere, where it can be copied, shared, and eventually taken up by more official chroniclers. The modern historian, to untangle this web, relies on the lexical analysis of manuscripts to detect the antiquity of certain expressions, comparisons with other ballads of the same era, for example, those referring to other outlaws or legendary archers, and the study of the spread of myths in fairs, churches, and traveling theaters. This method reveals that the first Robin Hood ballads are part of a broader context, where narrative song serves both to entertain and to disseminate veiled criticisms of power. The term Robinades, sometimes used by specialists, flourishes in the 14th century, while the kingdom suffers social tensions and outbreaks of violence, including the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Even if Robin Hood is not explicitly cited as a leader of revolt in these events, his aura as a champion of the oppressed is reinforced in the popular imagination. The connections between these English ballads and other European traditions can be highlighted, though they remain more tenuous at this stage. While in France, popular epics, longues chansons de geste or tales of bandits, are also sung, the figure of Robin does not immediately implant itself there. In Scotland, however, ballads like Robin Hood and the Monk circulate and nourish the Scottish variant of the myth, sometimes tinged with rivalry towards England, sometimes with a shared admiration for the hero's mischievousness. This plurality attests that, long before the end of the Middle Ages, Robin Hood has already left the status of a simple rumor character to become part of a full-fledged legendary cycle. When considering the influence of religious theater, it is essential to place these performances within the liturgical context. Most of the miracle plays and mystery plays of the time take place during specific festive periods of the Christian calendar, such as Christmas, Easter, or Pentecost. The May Games, on the other hand, are both a seasonal and secular extension, as the resurgence of spring is accompanied by popular joy, encouraged by local clergy who willingly tolerate some liberties, as long as Christian morality is not gravely offended. Robin, a bucolic character connected to the forest, easily fits into this framework. He is not necessarily placed in a biblical narrative, but in a recreational interlude, in the form of a skit or song. This integration into the May festivities allows a very wide audience to be reached, as the church itself sometimes calls on the community to participate in these celebrations to reaffirm the unity of the group. The inhabitants come in droves to enjoy themselves, sing, and laugh at performances that, while staging sacred episodes, quite naturally slip towards humor and exaggeration. Thus, it happens that in certain municipal documents, there are records of money devoted to the celebration of the Robin Hood game. These are collections or quests made on the occasion of these celebrations, where an individual dressed as Robin or one of his companions solicits the generosity of the spectators. The funds collected do not serve to enrich a real-life outlaw, but to fund the organization of other festivities or parish projects. The name Robin, being pronounced, sung, proclaimed during these spring ceremonies, becomes increasingly familiar to all layers of English society. One can imagine that even those who are not passionate about the theatricalization of the legend end up knowing its outlines, as it is omnipresent during the beautiful season. The local garrisons and municipal officials generally tolerate these manifestations as they recruit from all social classes, thus diluting the subversive potential of the myth in an atmosphere of general merrymaking. Throughout the 14th century, the popularity of Robin Hood continues to grow. References to his name multiply in judicial archives, sometimes to designate a suspected accomplice in acts of banditry, sometimes to mock an adversary. Scribes revisit cases of cattle theft or hostage-taking, emphasizing that the culprits would behave like Robin Hood. This fame moves the character from pure anecdote to becoming part of a true collective imagination, where he becomes the representative of a specific literary type, the outlaw. Medieval England knows other famous outlaws, but none reach the same posterity. The anonymous ballads dedicated to Robin feature dramatic roles, recurring adventures, and a moral drive that gives them additional depth. Although it is dangerous to confuse a literary phenomenon with strict historical reality, these ballads feed on societal facts, bearing witness to the fascination with highway robbery, self-defense in a sometimes oppressive feudal context, and the quest for equity. The strength of the emerging legend also owes much to the local idiom. The ballads being written in a Middle English accessible to a segment of the literate population, they please by their rhymes and easily memorable refrains. Many historians consider that the essence of these popular songs lies as much in their narrative content as in the collective pleasure of singing and dancing around a fire, or in a clearing during festivities. The characters of Robin's band, Little John, Will Scarlet, Much, Friar Tuck, each gain individuality in these songs, offering the public a range of figures to identify with. In A Jest of Robin Hood, one can already perceive the structuring of the brotherhood, the role of each member, and the recurring theme of hospitality. The ballads thus build a universe where the forest of Sherwood or Barnesdale becomes an alternative microcosm governed by laws based on distributive justice rather than the feudal hierarchy. Proof of the growing popularity of the narrative. References to Robinsonades, a term sometimes coined by analogy, appear in later English chronicles, although they do not always have a direct connection. Official chroniclers, more inclined to describe major political events, sometimes cast a wary eye on these popular entertainments deemed frivolous. However, even within some monasteries, the practice of copying ballad texts is not entirely absent, as it allows for the material preservation of the narratives. Margins of liturgical manuscripts are sometimes adorned with small drawings depicting an archer or notes alluding to a hood. It is not possible to systematically prove that this refers to the legendary hero, but these doodles attest to a cultural universe broader than just copies of religious writings. The May Games, for their part, sometimes serve as a laboratory for scenic renewal. In the 14th century, the organization of these celebrations evolves. Certain lay brotherhoods, once under the control of the clergy, gain increasing autonomy. They manage the staging of the performances, oversee the purchase of costumes, and collect donations from spectators. In this context, Robin Hood integrates into the dramaturgy as an already familiar figure, which can be reinvented according to local needs. Sometimes, his protective role towards peasants is emphasized because the region has suffered from excessive taxes or mistreatment. Elsewhere, the chivalrous aspect of a magnanimous Robin, akin to a courtly model, is favored. The Church, while keeping an eye on the orthodoxy of scenes with a religious character, admits that a part of comedy and profane folklore mixes into the program. Accounts from guilds or fraternities then mention expenses for Robin Hood's outfit, the crafting of a ceremonial bow, or the construction of small forest sets. On each occasion, the legend consolidates, and the hero becomes more ingrained in the local memory. Towards the end of the 14th century, several sources begin to attest to the existence of more elaborate ballad cycles, in which not only stories attributed to Robin Hood appear, but also more general texts from English vernacular literature. Scribes compile moral poems, practical instructions, and these famous outlaw tales into a single manuscript, often intended for a wealthy patron or a monastic library, curious about popular trends. This is how fragments of the A-Gest of Robin Hood reach us, recopied after or in the margins of other works. Today's medieval literature enthusiasts must therefore navigate between these different compilations, often incomplete, to reconstruct the epic as it was told orally. Specialists assume that many texts have disappeared for lack of being transcribed or preserved in good conditions. Nevertheless, the few remaining written versions attest to the vitality of the legend and its inscription in the English cultural landscape. Little John, whom the English ballads often refer to as Jean le Petit, is an essential figure in the tale of Robin Hood. His paradoxical nickname, with humorous connotations, is rooted in the oral tradition of medieval England. Often described as a tall man with an imposing physique and formidable strength, he represents the archetype of the loyal companion who chooses to stand by Robin for both moral and social reasons. The term déclassé vavasseur, applied to Little John, generally indicates that he might have come from a family of small landowners, relatively free but without great power, before an event, sometimes of feudal injustice or a local conflict, forced him into exile or illegality. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the notion of vavasseur referred to an intermediate rank in the feudal hierarchy. These men often served a more powerful lord, owned some land, and depended on a complex hierarchy of rights and duties. In this configuration, a vavasseur had prerogatives that distinguished him from the simple serf, but he did not reach the status or power of a knight or a baron. From the point of view of early textual sources, the character of Little John is frequently encountered in numerous medieval ballads, which emphasize his unwavering loyalty to Robin Hood. Among Anglo-Saxon popular songs, there are specific indications showing that this character is not just an amusing sidekick. He plays the role of assistant and moral guarantor of the principles defended by the benevolent outlaw. When Robin, in several versions, faces different enemies in a chivalrous manner, we see Little John positioning himself in logistical support, offering his strength or ingenuity. In the ballads titled A Jest of Robin Hood, which date back to the late 15th century but are based on older traditions, the tricks that Little John sets up to rob wealthy travelers are recounted. These tricks, intended to redistribute money to impoverished peasants, reflect a peasant solidarity that resonated during the time of seigneurial burdens weighing on the common folk. The initial meeting of Little John with Robin is often set at the edge of a narrow bridge amidst the forest trails of Sherwood or Barnesdale, depending on the versions. This bridge motif immediately marks the symbolic opposition between two men of different origins, but united by the same sense of justice. Ordinarily, Robin challenges anyone who dares to face him before crossing the bridge. Little John, more massive, steps forward. The duel, armed with sticks or heavy walking staffs, highlights the brute strength of the giant and the dexterity of Robin. At the end of this confrontation, Little John, defeated or almost equal to Robin according to the stories, acknowledges the leadership of his adversary and joins his band. This scene very popular in theatrical performances from the late Middle Ages, crystallizes the idea that outlaw brotherhood is acquired through a form of physical trial as well as a moral cause. It is essential for an international audience unfamiliar with the English feudal hierarchy to understand that beyond the folkloric symbol, Little John illustrates the delicate position of many uprooted individuals at the time. The succession conflicts between kings and lords, as well as the incessant wars, particularly those led by King John and his barons, often forced small landowners or vavassors to choose exile rather than face seigneurial debts, overwhelming taxes, or threatening political rivalries. Taking to the forest and living as an outlaw was sometimes more a matter of survival than a desire for brigandage. Little John then embodies a figure of Robin's lieutenant, ready to use violence to defend his own, yet always carrying a keen sense of honor. Thus, in some texts, he is less inclined to cunning than Robin or Will Scarlet, preferring direct confrontation. He is often, in later narratives, the guarantor of a certain straightforwardness and rural simplicity that contrasts with the intrigues and pretenses of the court. Will Scarlet, Much, and Alana Dale complete the social and cultural spectrum united within the band. Will Scarlet, sometimes mentioned under the names of Will Scarlock or Scarlet, holds a particular status. He may appear as a relative of Robin. In some late ballads, he is said to be Robin's cousin, or simply as a loyal companion. In many versions, he has a talent for handling the sword and is quick, spirited, even impulsive. His nickname often evokes a scarlet garment, perhaps a sign of some affluence or a taste for display, a detail found in some later portrayals. Will Scarlet, according to interpretations, could be from a slightly less modest background than Little John, the son of a merchant, a relatively prosperous artisan, or a trusted man fallen from grace. In any case, he provides a counterpoint to the other outlaws, more elegant, sometimes more daring. He has fueled many dramatic variations where his bold actions serve the plot. Manuscripts and ballads regularly depict him as a young man eager for adventure, fascinated by Robin and the freedom offered by the forest, even if it means breaking feudal laws. Much, for his part, is often referred to as Much the Miller's son. This name clearly places him at the level of the simplest rural society, where a miller's family could know a certain local affluence thanks to the mill and flour distribution. In English folklore, the miller often occupies an ambiguous position, sometimes close to the people, sometimes accused of taking too large a percentage of the grain. The character of Much reflects the idea of a village boy, subjected very early to the injustices of local power, sometimes caught in wrongdoing for forgetting to pay the share due to the lord, or accused of clandestine trading. In several ballads, Much spontaneously joins Robin's band out of a thirst for freedom and to escape the hassles or even punishments that threaten his family. He often provides practical knowledge of the terrain, serving as a guide or logistician, finding food, spotting discreet river routes, or negotiating with the surrounding peasants. His role, less flamboyant than Will Scarlet's, is nonetheless essential to the group's smooth operation. Alana Dale constitutes another striking feature of this gallery of characters. He appears as a minstrel, a troubadour, or a simple itinerant musician, depending on the versions. In medieval English literature, the figure of the minstrel is associated with the entertainment of feudal courts, but also with the circulation of stories from one fiefdom to another. The ballads gladly include him in Robin's circle to highlight the importance of music and song as vectors of common identity. One of the most famous episodes involving Alana Dale, shows him hopelessly in love with a young woman who is being forced into a marriage. Robin, provoked by the injustice and perhaps sensitive to romance, helps the minstrel to interrupt the baronial ceremony, then organizes a clandestine wedding in the forest, out of sight. This episode was staged in several 14th and 15th century stories, then adapted in theatrical renditions. It highlights the chivalrous dimension of Robin in the sense that he defends the freedom to love against marriages of interest or convenience while entrusting the minstrel with a literary role. Alan will be, in a way, responsible for praising Robin's bravery and immortalizing his exploits. In a medieval context where orality remains a widely favored means of expression, the presence of a musician within the band attests to a desire to spread the reputation and ideal of justice of these outlaws. Friar Tuck, a unique figure in this forest saga, illustrates the tension between the official church and marginal classes. His real name, unknown or fictitious, he is supposedly a monk or a lay brother, that is to say, an unordained member of the regular clergy who also chose to go underground. According to tradition, he could have been expelled from a monastery or accused of sympathizing with rebels or guilty of various misdeeds. In the stories, he first appears in 15th century ballads as Friar Tuck, a boisterous character, fond of good food and drink, but deeply devoted to the common good. He is often seen performing clandestine baptisms or masses in the forest, in tumultuous opposition with the ecclesiastical hierarchy, reputed to be corrupt in popular narratives. At that time, the English people already harbored a certain mistrust towards some abbots and prelates accused of living in opulence. Friar Tuck therefore stands against the abuses of the institution while remaining a sincere believer. He preaches charity, offers absolution to sinners who repent, and accompanies Robin as the group's unofficial chaplain. His corpulent appearance, combined with a jovial temperament, highlights a carnivalesque aspect that playwrights, especially those of the Elizabethan theater, have not failed to emphasize. He can be seen in hand-to-hand combat scenes, notably against Robin or Little John, where he defends himself with minimal martial skill but great energy. This extraordinary friar echoes the idea that faith can serve the people rather than be to their detriment. In popular culture, he becomes a symbol of this parallel church close to the humble, a notable contrast with bishops and archbishops linked to royal power. In some versions, Friar Tuck presents himself in disguise to officiate weddings or funerals, demonstrating that even within the religious institution, there are margins of freedom ready to challenge the established order. An international audience not accustomed to the subtleties of medieval religion must understand that the divide between high clergy and wandering monks was far from anecdotal. Indeed, the movement of mendicant orders, Franciscans, Dominicans, the predominance of Cistercian or Benedictine monasteries, could generate men out of favor, like this Friar Tuck, who has passed into posterity as a bon vivant, a mocker of hypocrisy and a defender of simple Christianity. Maid Marian, another major character of the legend, enters the scene with an aura deeply associated with May Day celebrations and Marian ideology. The name Marian indeed echoes the cult of the Virgin Mary widespread in medieval Europe, but also the folkloric celebrations of May, during which village youths organize processions, dances, and games. Ancient texts and later representations show that originally, this female figure might have been less developed than she is today. Sometimes she was simply a symbol of spring rites or reduced to a dancing partner of Robin, then called Robin the Green Man, an allegorical character linked to fertility. Over the centuries, Maid Marian gradually established herself as Robin's companion, even as his betrothed or wife. From the 14th century, certain amateur plays and village celebrations included a couple formed by Robin and Marian, symbolizing an idealized love associating chivalric values and spiritual purity. Then, in the 15th and 16th centuries, under the influence of romanticized stories, she gained a more concrete role. She is presented as a noble lady, sometimes a distant cousin or close to a baronial house, who shares Robin's ideals of justice and equity. In many ballads, Marian is described as brave, skilled in archery or light weaponry, thus joining the fight against oppression on the field. This aspect of the chivalric woman is characteristic of medieval legends, where female figures sometimes disguise themselves as men to fight. The romantic character of Maid Marian is further emphasized in later rewritings. She is then seen defying the will of a parent or a forced fiancé, or fleeing to take refuge in the forest alongside Robin. These episodes, which multiply towards the end of the Middle Ages, help forge the image of a couple united by pure love and unfailing loyalty to the cause of the poor. From an international perspective, Maid Marian embodies the familiar figure of the heroine who transcends feudal constraints, breaks free from arranged marriages, and places justice above blind obedience to power. While she is sometimes depicted as slightly in the background in some medieval ballads, later versions have transformed Maid Marian into a protagonist in her own right, on par with Robin, Little John, or Friar Tuck. Several manuscripts or descriptions of May Games attest to the evolution of the character from a simple folkloric symbol to the embodiment of a noble resistance fighter. The young woman becomes a way to evoke the growing place of heroines in literature, while remaining consistent with the gallant and chivalric spirit of the time. She is not just a romantic foil. She participates in the band's strategies, conceals information, and sometimes acts as an intermediary between the outlaws and the townspeople. In this sense, Maid Marian reflects the image of a free, skilled, and determined woman. More local oral traditions recount her escapades to transfer money to the poor or to devise diversion plans targeting the sheriff. These details, recorded by later chroniclers, illustrate her ability to perfectly integrate into the collective dynamic. The Sheriff of Nottingham, meanwhile, remains the great historical antagonist of the legend. In feudal England, a sheriff was a royal officer responsible for administering the county, collecting taxes, and maintaining order. Nottingham, a city located among other places near Sherwood Forest, is significant for the royal power. Its geographical position makes it an important hub of trade routes and relations between the north and south of the kingdom. At the turn of the 12th and 13th centuries, the city was under the control of local lords and the king, who sometimes established a strict fiscal regime there. Peasants, merchants, and foresters find themselves subject to the direct authority of a sheriff who enjoys broad powers. He can organize manhunts against outlaws, confiscate the goods of those who have not paid taxes, and demand ransoms to release prisoners. In the ballads, this character symbolizes institutionalized oppression, unilateral justice, and abuse of power. Literary tradition clearly makes him Robin Hood's main rival, multiplying anecdotes where the sheriff tries to trap the outlaw in an archery tournament or with the promise of a tempting reward. The divergences between sources show that several real individuals may have borne this title in Nottingham at different times. Historians have proposed multiple hypotheses to identify who might have inspired the legend: William de Wendenall, Philip Mark, Eustace of Loudham, or other royal officials disliked by the local population. Each could have been at the origin of fiscal oppressions, expropriations, or arbitrary arrests. Folkloric narratives have condensed these figures into a single enemy, sometimes arrogant, cowardly, or cruel. Over the versions, this sheriff is portrayed sometimes as a mere executor for the king, sometimes as a greedy and corrupt leader acting on his own behalf. The common point remains the relentless pursuit of Robin, aiming to subdue or eliminate him, and to restore an order where people's money must be returned to the lords or royal coffers. In the medieval context, this confrontation with authority resonated strongly. It staged the desire to escape a system where the slightest infraction of forest laws, like hunting a deer meant for the king, was met with severe punishments. Guy of Gisborne, another notable antagonist, sometimes allies with the sheriff in certain versions, or is employed by him to assassinate or capture Robin. Unlike the sheriff, an administrative figure, Guy of Gisborne appears in tradition as a knight or mercenary with a sinister reputation. In the ballad Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne, probably from the 15th century, he is depicted clad in animal skins with a dark and threatening demeanor, as if embodying the beastly side of feudal authority. In this tale, Guy boasts of being commissioned to hunt Robin, and the confrontation ends in a fatal duel. The early texts emphasize the violent and brutal aspect of this mercenary, in direct contrast to Robin's nobility of spirit. Folklore presents him somewhat as an anti-Robin, just as skilled in combat, but dedicated to serving an unjust order, claiming to uphold the law while primarily serving the Lord's interests. He is a rather secondary character in most adaptations, but he perfectly embodies the feudal obsession with the hunt, mixing personal bravery with a thirst for reward. While Guy of Gisborne, in some stories, is merely an adjunct to the sheriff, others mention him as an ambitious competitor, ready to outdo the royal officer to win favor with John Lackland or to claim the bounty on Robin's head. Literature from the late Middle Ages alludes to characters of mercenaries likely to be used as henchmen in the baronial conflicts. The idea of hiring the services of a knight or experienced swordsman to capture a rebel is not foreign to feudal practices. Private warfare was common, and itinerant soldiers or outlaws seeking rehabilitation were willingly recruited, sometimes called upon to lead manhunt expeditions. Guy of Gisborne is the stereotype of these hardened fighters without religious or moral scruples, devoting all their loyalty to the highest bidder. This gallery of characters, companions of Robin, or enemies representing the established power, reflects the complexity of medieval English society, marked by significant tensions. In the stories, companionship is based on the solidarity of the weak and oppressed, while the antagonists embody a latent distrust of legal authority holders supposed to represent the king or the feudal elite. The marginalized, whether they are downgraded vavasors, millers breaking with taxes, rebellious monks, or seekers of freedom, show the variety of paths that could lead to dissidence. On the other side, sheriffs and mercenary knights remind us that the king's extended arm, through his officers, sought by all means to curb dissent, whether criminal, fiscal, or more purely symbolic. The group of Robin, as constituted in the ballads, thus forms a forest micro-society, parallel to the feudal world, where each individual has their function and recognized place in an informal hierarchy centered on loyalty and justice. The presence of a character like Little John, with his physical power and straightforward sense of camaraderie, undoubtedly contributed to popularizing the image of a band that is both united and diverse. Will Scarlett, Much, and Alana Dale highlight the multifaceted aspect of this gathering. There is both the miller's son and the sensitive musician, or the more elegant companion, each bringing a nuance to the collective portrait. Friar Tuck, in opposing the church, too compromised with power, embodies religious dissidence anchored in popular faith. Maid Marian, for her part, introduces the romantic tone and the idea that a woman can fully participate in action, which for the men and women of the time went beyond mere romance. Against this supportive community, the Sheriff of Nottingham and Guy of Gisborne stand as symbols of repression and legalized violence, determined to maintain a rigid system. Confronted by the cunning and bravery of the band, they often engage in punitive expeditions that end up failing, revealing the weaknesses of an authority too blinded by its interests. The traditional story that opens the adventures of Robin Hood is situated at the precise moment when the hero loses his rights, his lands, and his place in the social order of England. According to various anonymous ballads, later compiled in collections like the famous A Jest of Robin Hood, it is said that he was unjustly accused of poaching or victimized by seigneurial intrigues. In some variants, it is the personal grudge of a local sheriff, jealous of Robin's rank or archery skills, that triggers his disgrace. In other versions, the confiscation of his goods is attributed to forced debts, accrued due to attacks on small landowners or increasing royal repression during crusade times. Scholars have long debated the exact location of these events, as the old texts mention either Barnesdale, a wooded area south of Yorkshire, or Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire. Both sites vie for this honor, and it is not uncommon for local traditions to attempt to promote one or the other under the pretext of having authentically sheltered the legendary outlaw. In any case, the forest represents a liminal space and a haven far from taxes, the grip of royal officers and powerful lords. The woods at this time are governed by a strict feudal system, royal forests, where hunting is reserved for the king or his guests, while poaching is punishable by severe penalties. Studies conducted on medieval archives, notably the Forest Rolls, testify to strict regulations in forested areas like Sherwood, where the monarch delegates surveillance to guards or sheriffs. According to legends, Robin, dispossessed of his land and fugitive, voluntarily dives into this sylvan world as dangerous as it is protective. Banishment becomes the starting point of a clandestine life. He has no choice but to live outside the law, which, in medieval England, officially excludes him from legal protection. It is no longer possible for him to plead before royal courts. He thus becomes a legitimate target for officers. This condition, harsh as it is, will paradoxically be the opportunity to take on the role of a justiciar or good outlaw in the popular imagination. The initial expropriation lays the groundwork for a central conflict in the cycle. A renowned individual known for his integrity and generosity clashes with the corruption of a feudal power embodied by the sheriff, his armed men, and sometimes even high-ranking clergy. However, sources differ on the exact identity of the lord responsible for the injustice. In older ballads, it is often an anonymous adversary, whereas later tradition quickly highlights the Sheriff of Nottingham as the main antagonist. Folk anecdotes gathered from the inhabitants of Nottinghamshire often refer to a specific place to narrate the expropriation. The legend sometimes points to the town of Loxley, associated with the surname Loxley mentioned in some versions. In Barnesdale, further north, there is a field named Robin Hood's Field, where oral tradition places Robin's ultimate attempt to avoid the seizure of his property. This first step of the legendary Odyssey invariably ends with the hero's retreat, who, accompanied or not by a few loyal followers from the very start. Little John appears in some initial versions, in others he does not intervene until later. gains the thickets of the forest to live on the margins of society. The rugged topography, the ravines, the ancient trees, and the impenetrable thickets play an essential narrative role in highlighting Robin's break with the civilized world. The forest then becomes his kingdom, a secret realm where he can catch his breath and soon gather companions who will share his destiny. One of the most famous episodes in the cycle recounts the meeting of Robin and Little John, often described as an impromptu duel on a narrow bridge over a stream. In the ballads of the 15th century, it is an emblematic scene that illustrates the bravery and code of honor among the companions. Robin, seeking to cross the bridge, finds himself face to face with a giant on the other side, eager to assert his right of way. In the most popular version, both decide to settle the matter by a fair fight, armed only with oak or ash sticks. The first moments seem to favor Robin, reputed to be swift and strong with the sword or bow, but Little John, despite his imposing stature, wields his stick modestly and eventually unseats Robin. According to the ballad, Robin falls into the stream's waters and emerges soaked, but not humiliated. He rises, admires the prowess of his adversary, and invites him to join his band, arguing that such a valiant man should be an ally rather than an enemy. From this first meeting, the legend emphasizes the sense of loyalty and brotherhood that will guide the outlaws. In several accounts, it is important that the fight is non-lethal. The two protagonists do not use their bows or blades, indicating that they adhere to a chivalric code, even in the forest. The texts also highlight the comedic dimension of the scene. Robin, the undisputed leader, is beaten at stick fighting. The humor enhances the popular appeal of this passage, and folklorists note that there were reenactments of this duel during May festivals, where actors portrayed Robin and John in mummers' plays, small improvised theatrical pieces. This chance encounter marks the true foundation of the Merry Men Company, the group of joyful and devoted companions that will become the signature of the legend. Little John emerges as the quintessential brotherly figure, often described as a dispossessed vavasor, that is, a free peasant landowner or a small noble sidelined, making him akin to Robin in his status as an outcast. Later, artistic representations, notably in the 18th century engravings, accentuate the physical contrast between this tall fellow and his leader. Symbolically, Little John becomes Robin's alter ego, ready to temper or summarize the leader's thoughts. The trial of the bridge seals a friendship whose sincerity is emphasized in all texts, illustrating the idea that outside the feudal law, another form of loyalty is woven, more egalitarian and fraternal, which structured a significant part of the English imagination. After forming a core group of loyal followers, Robin, in the traditional course of the stories, goes through a phase of learning life in the forest. The first confrontations with local authorities occur, particularly when Robin and his men help peasants who are victims of the collector's abuses. In the ballad known as Robin Hood and the Monk, there is a reference to an episode where Robin protests against the confiscation of religious properties. Although this reference is sometimes debated, it illustrates a recurring theme: Robin's confrontation with the plundering that afflicts the humble. Then comes the famous scene of the broken quiver, mentioned in various versions, describing a pivotal moment. Robin breaks or throws away his quiver, a symbol of potential violence, to vow only to take up arms to protect the common people and reduce the burden of taxes. In some later adaptations, it is the sight of an old man dispossessed and unable to pay the royal taxes that moves Robin. Shocked and angered by the injustice, he makes a vow: the gold extorted from the weak will be taken back from the powerful and returned to the victims. Local informants from the Nottingham area claim that some wayside crosses, centuries old, were associated with this legendary vow. In Barnesdale, Landmarks such as Robin Hood's Well or Little John's Cross are still surrounded by superstitions recalling the supposed promise to protect the most vulnerable. Beyond its dramatic nature, this scene holds a strong symbolic charge. The archer's quiver, broken or suspended, evokes the tool that could have been used to steal for ego or violence. Here, it becomes the mark of a moral commitment. In medieval literature, heroes like Eustace the Monk or Hereward the Wake have already expressed the same demand for justice against feudal injustice. But Robin Hood remains the most popular embodiment of this narrative pivot. Banishment transforms into a personal crusade on behalf of the underdog. Commentators highlight the power of the message. Rather than rebellion being a mere desire for personal vengeance, it transforms into a true popular cause, referring to the idea of social banditry described by historian Eric Hobsbawm, where the outlaw becomes the community's protector. One of the most celebrated exploits is the archery tournament organized under the auspices of the Sheriff, who seeks to capture Robin through trickery. In the legendary construction, it is a carefully prepared trap. Knowing that Robin is renowned for his archery skills and unshakable pride, the Sheriff decides to hold a shooting contest to lure the outlaw out of hiding. Various texts place this episode either in Nottingham or in a nearby town, with the promise of a rich reward for the winner. Robin, against the advice of his more cautious companions, cannot resist taking on the challenge. According to the most common version, he appears disguised as an old pilgrim or craftsman, sometimes adorned with a fake beard or dressed in rags, to blend in among the other contestants. The key moment occurs when Robin shoots an arrow so perfect that it pierces another contender's arrow, splitting it lengthwise. This feat solidifies his reputation as England's best archer. Sources mention that at the end of the competition, the Sheriff or one of his men, intrigued by this incredible performance, seeks to unmask him. In some ballads, Robin manages to escape by leaping onto a horse lent by an accomplice. In others, he issues a rallying cry that attracts Little John and a few archers hidden around the field, allowing him to scale the town's wall. This rigged tournament may have an impact on what follows. The Sheriff, furious at such humiliation, redoubles his efforts to capture the leader of the outlaws. From a symbolic point of view, this scene plays a major role as it illustrates Robin's daring. Not only does he defy authority by venturing into the very circle drawn by the Sheriff, but he displays such formidable skill that it sometimes seems almost supernatural. In the medieval imagination, the elite archer enjoys a special aura, as the English were already distinguished in Europe for the quality of their infantry, and the legend has it that the English longbow was one of the decisive weapons in the late Middle Ages wars. By telling how Robin manages to split the opponent's arrow, the storytellers accentuate the hero's superiority, who, while being an outlaw, surpasses traditional chivalry in terms of skill. The local variations of Nottingham still circulate today, and a bust of Robin, armed with his bow, is erected near the city's castle to remind how this feat is a cornerstone of local tradition. In the series of adventures attributed to Robin, there is also a much more romantic episode, which illustrates the hero's ability to protect not only the oppressed peasant, but also sincere love threatened by obstacles. Allen a Dale, sometimes spelled Allen a Dale, is presented in the legend as a minstrel or a young squire, madly in love with a noble lady. Alas, the young woman, whose name varies according to the ballads or is not explicitly mentioned, is forcibly promised to an old baron or a wealthy noble determined to redeem her family's debts. This arranged marriage often takes place in the neighboring church under the supervision of a complacent priest or even a bishop intent on satisfying the local aristocracy. Alan then finds himself desperate, unable to oppose such power. Robin, upon learning of the situation, decides to intervene. Often described in an independent ballad, Robin Hood and Alan a Dale, this story tells how Robin and his companions infiltrate the church at the crucial moment of the ceremony. Little John and Will Scarlet sometimes play the role of improvised groomsmen. They interrupt the religiously orchestrated service, and Robin takes the bishop's sword or forces him to let the bride-to-be pronounce her vows to Alan, rather than to the imposed spouse. Far from being a pagan act or merely bravado, this is presented as a gesture of rehabilitation, of sincere love against feudal constraint. After the exchange of consents, Robin and his comrades flee with the legitimate couple, organizing a small celebration in the forest, often described as a joyous banquet. From a symbolic point of view, the elopement of Alan a Dale depicts Robin's determination to support individual aspirations against the orders of seigneurial hierarchy. In medieval society, arranged marriages are common, particularly to consolidate alliances and preserve a patrimony. Seeing an outlaw stand against this practice and succeed, thanks to a ruse in fulfilling true love, reinforces the idea that Robin advocates personal freedom and natural justice. Folklorists note that in several regions of England, this episode was reenacted during countryside festivals, with participants disguised as merry men and a fake couple receiving Robin Hood's symbolic blessing. Some historians even establish a link between this springtime celebration and ancient fertility ceremonies, where the spirit of the forest guaranteed amorous prosperity. As Robin's band continues the ambushes and kidnappings of tax collectors, a key event occurs in which the Sheriff of Nottingham, instead of being the hunter, becomes the prey. In several ballads, this reversal occurs on a path near the forest's edge when the sheriff, convinced he has located Robin, travels with a reduced escort to ensure the outlaw's capture. Yet, through cunning and perfect knowledge of the area, Robin and his companions manage to isolate the dignitary. They capture him, take him into the heart of the forest, and keep him under good guard. In face of this incredible reversal, the oral tradition emphasizes the sheriff's incredulity, accustomed to hunting Robin rather than being captured. According to the ballad Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham, in certain versions grouped in a jest of Robin Hood, this arrest sometimes has a punitive aspect. Robin reproaches the sheriff for his cruelty towards the poorest, the arbitrary punishments he inflicts, or his fiscal exactions. He is then dragged before an improvised tribunal composed of Robin's close friends and a few peasant witnesses, meant to judge his behavior. Sometimes, Robin forces him to participate in a rustic banquet, where he must eat and drink in the company of those he despises, a symbolic act of humiliation, emphasizing the subversion of the feudal order. In the end, the sheriff is often released, for ransom or a promise to moderate his policies. This clemency, orchestrated by Robin, shows a desire for justice rather than revenge. On a literary level, the arrest of the sheriff serves to demonstrate the power Robin has acquired in his forest domain. From now on, the social banditry of the group not only resists, it manages to lay hands on the highest local authority. Some historians see it as an allegory. It is the triumph of popular justice over the corrupt institution. Regional anecdotes recount that in the Trent Valley, not far from Nottingham, an old hollow tree was once shown. said to have served as a makeshift prison for the captive sheriff. The legends attached to this major oak abound, although it is today more associated with Robin's hideout than the sheriff's. Then follows a crucial episode which, according to some versions, provisionally concludes Robin's adventures, the coming of King Richard the Lionheart, disguised under a costume. In the legendary chronology, this event is placed after the end of the Third Crusade 1192, or during a brief return of the monarch to English soil. The striking element is that Robin, unaware of the visitor's identity, offers him hospitality, or, in a common variant, forces him to pay a toll in the forest like any passing traveler. The ballads emphasize Richard's prolonged absence, often described as a good king compared to his brother, John Lackland. Due to this long absence, Robin and his men are said to have become the protectors of the people. When Richard reveals himself, the dramatic effect is assured. The outlaw kneels and regrets his ignorance, while the sovereign recognizes in Robin a vassal still loyal to the throne. According to the legend, the king grants him a pardon, allowing him to momentarily regain legality. In some ballads, Robin is even offered an official role at court, sometimes as a royal forester or in a similar position. In others, Richard also grants pardons to the members of the group, struck by the valor and sense of honor of these outlaws. It must be said that the figure of Richard the Lionheart occupies a unique place in the collective imagination, reputed chivalrous and courageous. He has become the emblem of the ideal king, even though, historically, he resided little in England and his reign was punctuated by costly wars. Nevertheless, most accounts agree on the ephemeral nature of the royal pardon. Shortly thereafter, Richard would have gone back to warring in France, or would have succumbed to a new military campaign. England then falls back under the sway of councillors or barons who resume the war against the outlaws. As a result, Robin, disenchanted, ultimately returns to hiding, realizing he cannot hope for lasting change without the effective presence of a just king. This brief compliance with feudal law was a fleeting episode, a moment of grace where royal justice recognizes its debt to a popular hero. The ultimate act of Robin's tragedy takes place in the Kirklees area in Yorkshire, in a priory to which, according to some late chroniclers, Robin's family or that of one of his relatives was linked. The more recent ballads from the 14th or 15th century narrate that the famous outlaw, now aging or wounded, goes to the Kirklees priory to be treated by a nun, sometimes identified as his aunt or a distant relative. The accounts differ as to the cause of his condition. Some mention poisoning, others a wound received in a fight against one of the sheriff's men, others still a simple illness due to life in the open air and lack of resources in the forest. The tragic outcome lies in the fact that the prioress, instead of healing him, bleeds him to death, either out of treachery or by following higher orders. In some versions, it is the prior of the same congregation who, in secret, has colluded with the enemy to eliminate Robin. The ballads emphasize the hero's slow agony as he realizes too late the ruse he has fallen victim to. A final scene, repeated throughout the tales, evokes the presence of Little John, who stays by his side until his last breath. Robin, half unconscious, asks for his bow and shoots one last arrow through a window of the priory. Wherever the arrow lands, that is where he wishes to be buried. This funeral arrow becomes a symbol of Robin's ultimate will, to choose the place of his final rest without depending on the authorities' will. This poignant ending has sparked numerous commentaries. From a folkloric perspective, it highlights the sacred dimension of the bow, a lifelong companion, and the communion between Robin and nature. The landing points of this famous arrow, or the alleged grave of Robin, are located within the precincts of Kirklees Priory, where, according to 19th century sources, there was a tombstone bearing an enigmatic epitaph dating back to the 13th or 14th century. Historical excursions in the 19th century report that the stone, heavily damaged, might have contained the letters R.O.B., sometimes read as Robin of Barnesdale. However, the authenticity of this burial site remains contested, the epitaph being difficult to decipher and mostly considered by historians as a late fake or an overinterpretation. In some continental stories, adapted from or inspired by the English myth, it is sometimes said that Robin does not truly die, but simply vanishes into the woods, adding to the long list of legendary sleeping heroes promised a return. Yet, the most influential ballads in medieval literature, historians indeed mention the Kirklees scene as the dramatic closure, Robin defeated by the treachery of a clergy member, even though he had often collaborated with more upright religious figures like Friar Tuck. The dramatic angle is strong. The hero places his trust in a sanctuary, a place meant to embody protection and care, but finds his doom there, illustrating the growing distrust of the people towards part of the high clergy accused of colluding with great lords. The tales surrounding Robin Hood, as they have come to us in medieval ballads and later texts, reveal several common traits that far exceed the simple setting of an outlaw band hiding in the forest. These characteristics, sometimes referred to as transversal themes or literary motifs, express both a grounding in the social context of feudal England and point to more universal aspirations. They illuminate how the myth was forged, a mix of resistance against a perceived unjust system, a taste for popular festivity, a celebration of cunning and equality in the face of institutionalized violence. This way, a shared set of meanings emerges, where the legend becomes a mirror of medieval tensions and hopes, while also drawing on elements from other traditions, be they continental or even more distant. Historians and medieval literature specialists have identified several major thematic axes, including the critique of fiscal oppression, the justification of the outlaw who does good, the symbolic importance of the forest space, the use of disguise as subversion of the established order, and the figure of an ideal but absent sovereign. They have also identified unexpected parallels, interesting variants, and survivals in various folklores and festive practices outside England. The aspects detailed below allow an international audience to understand how the figure of Robin Hood could acquire such resonance in the collective imagination, to the point of transcending borders and eras. At the heart of the legend of Robin Hood is the claim for a more equitable justice, notably in response to the growing tax pressure imposed by the monarchy or by certain local lords. Ancient ballads often depict scenes where Robin and his companions lay ambushes for tax collectors tasked with levying sums deemed excessive. In several versions of the story, these royal officers are portrayed as greedy or corrupt, capitalizing on their positions to extract more money than ordered. The peasants and smallholders, already burdened by seigneurial dues and royal taxes, thus end up paying twice. This protest dimension against a system deemed oppressive has greatly contributed to shaping the image of an outlaw with a heart of gold, rebelling to defend the oppressed rather than himself. The concept of the good outlaw fits within a long literary and folkloric tradition, where the individual hunted by the law remains nonetheless virtuous. Even in a feudal context where legislation is closely linked to the king's power, People have always dreamed of a man capable of standing up against abuses of power. Medieval archives show that banditry was not uncommon, especially during times of war or famine. However, few outlaw figures have achieved the same notoriety as Robin Hood. The reason partly lies in the association between this banditry and a redistribution of wealth that is romantically imagined as fair and equitable. In the ballads, Robin often takes from those who exploit the poor to give to those who suffer, thus transforming into a popular justice seeker. The intensity of this theme can also be explained by the need to dream of a higher moral order, where illegality becomes legitimate when the prevailing law is perceived as deeply unjust. It is an idea later found in several European literatures, a critique of taxation and the judicial apparatus as a cause of rebellion, while suggesting that the rebel acts in the name of the common good. This aspiration for social justice, rooted in the story of Robin Hood, does not boil down to a mere rejection of all authority. It is more a desire to moralize power, whether royal or local. Scenarios of ransom, where a knight or tax collector is stripped and then released after taking an oath of good conduct, suggest that Robin does not systematically hate the nobility or the monarchy. He contests the distorted and abusive use of their authority while respecting the ideal of a just sovereign. Thus, the good outlaw refers to the paradox of an individual on the fringes of the law, but bearing a superior legitimacy due to his concern for the people. In medieval England, the forest was not simply a wooded mass, but often an area governed by its own rules, particularly regarding hunting. The royal forests, governed by the forest law, were subject to strict regulations. Deer and other game were reserved for the king, while serfs and smallholders were forbidden from poaching under threat of severe penalties. Yet, it is precisely in this legislative gray area that the adventures of Robin Hood and his companions are situated. The stories often emphasize Sherwood, located in Nottinghamshire, or Barnesdale in Yorkshire, as refugees for the banished. These forests then become symbols of freedom and resistance, to the point of conveying the image of a micro-society with its own codes. The concept of a liminal space refers to an intermediate place where ordinary rules are suspended or reinterpreted. Historians and anthropologists note that the forest in the legend of Robin Hood operates as a parallel world at the margins of the classic feudal system. Certainly, there is the idea of secrecy, hiding among the trees, outwitting the sheriff's patrols, avoiding monitored paths. But beyond this practical dimension, the forest represents a spiritual and social refuge where outlaws recreate a more equitable justice. The sharing of the bounty, the discussed equality among band members, the welcoming of peasants in distress, combine to form a sort of ideal society, inverting the usual hierarchies. Robin's numerous exploits therefore take place in a nature sometimes described as warm, sometimes as mysterious. The ancient trees provide both shelter and a setting, suited to epic duels or rebellious speeches. Various ballads evoke the rustling of branches as a protective, almost mystical presence that lends the forest a sacred character. Poaching, criminalized by royal authority, becomes an act of asserting freedom against the monopoly on hunting. This unique relationship, where the forest transforms into a moral bastion against external abuses, reinforces the idea of a counterpower. Violations of the law, such as capturing a deer, become symbolic gestures to assert the right of the humble to survive or celebrate according to their own customs. Thus, forest isolation, far from being a mere escape, asserts itself as the expression of a parallel order, serving both as a refuge and a reservoir of alternative laws. In many ballads and anecdotes about Robin Hood, a recurring motif is that of disguise. The hero and his companions dress as pilgrims, monks, butchers, or merchants to deceive their adversaries or infiltrate a guarded place. This practice of the mask is not limited to mere cunning. It is part of a staging that temporarily overturns social statuses. In medieval culture, carnival periods or May festivities already allowed inversion games, where the poor could mimic the rich and the fool could reign for a day like a king. Robin Hood's exploits perpetuate this spirit, but in a more radical way. The disguise is not just festive, it allows for subversion and survival. Historically, disguises were a common means to deceive the vigilance of law enforcement, especially in the context of secret alliances or plots against the Lord. However, in the collective imagination, Robin's ability to consistently evade the sheriff underscores the idea of a higher justice playing with feudal rigidities. The scene of the rigged archery tournament, where Robin appears incognito to win a prize offered by his enemies, perfectly illustrates this phenomenon. By blending into the crowd, Robin mocks authority on its own turf. The inversion continues when he reveals to the sheriff that he is the hunted one, but that he controls the situation to the end. This principle of role reversal goes even further with characters like Friar Tuck, an atypical monk who questions the strict separation between the laity and the official clergy, or even the figure of Maid Marian, whose dynamic varies according to the versions, sometimes as a simple hidden companion, sometimes disguised as a page to join Robin. The inconsistency of identities serves to remind us that in the world of the tale, there is freedom of movement and thought that opposes the hierarchical freeze imposed by feudalism. In this atmosphere reminiscent of a permanent carnival, the entire social organization seems capable of being overturned for a time before being reconstituted. This oscillation is at the heart of the popular appeal of the legend, which gives everyone the hope of a possible reversal of roles in the name of an ideal of equity and freedom. Another essential motif of the Robin Hood legend is the figure of the king, sometimes Richard the Lionheart, sometimes an unnamed sovereign meant to embody legitimate authority. This archetype of the good but distant monarch is found in several medieval tales. In the Arthurian cycle, for instance, King Arthur is surrounded by chivalric values, even though he is often absent from the scene and must delegate to his knights. In the case of Robin Hood, Richard's benevolence contrasts with the treachery of Prince John, who reigns as a tyrannical regent during the Crusades. This duality reinforces the idea that Robin does not challenge the monarchy, but rather the unjust embodiment of it when the throne is usurped by a corrupt or incompetent leader. The absent king is a common narrative device in European myths. His departure for war or a sacred mission leaves the kingdom in the hands of unscrupulous advisors. In the legend, Richard's absence on the crusade paves the way for fiscal oppression and the perversion of laws. Robin presents himself not as a man seeking to overthrow the monarchy, but rather to protect it from those who abuse their power in the legitimate sovereign's absence. Unlike more radical revolts, the Sherwood Band does not seek to establish a peasant republic, but merely demands the return of the legitimate king and the reaffirmation of royal justice. This ambivalence, a praise of ideal monarchy and rejection of actual practices, also surrounds Robin's figure with an aura of loyalty. Paradoxically, he becomes an ally of the crown against local corruption, even though he is pursued by representatives of power. In some texts, the final meeting between Robin and the king, in disguise or not, leads to a brief amnesty. Then, due to court intrigues or betrayed alliances, the outlaw must return to the forest. Such adventures illustrate the complexity of an era where loyalty to the sovereign did not mean blind obedience to all his officers. This motif of the just but absent king is fueled by a constant tension between hope and disillusionment, inviting the public to dream of a perfect leader who is slow to return. Medieval ballads emphasize the monarchy's potential for redemption while lamenting the brutality of local agents. Thus, the dramatic twist is based on both respectful faith towards royalty and relentless struggle against rapacious lords. Over the centuries, the general framework of the legend has been enriched with 1,000 details, some of which are little known to the general public. For example, an anecdote mentions that Robin, disguised as a butcher, sold meat at a derisory price in a local market to attract the attention of a greedy sheriff eager to get livestock at a low cost. The scene ends with a practical joke that Robin plays on the sheriff, mixing mischief with protest. These stories highlight a sense of cleverness that goes beyond mere bravery in combat. The laughter, triggered by Robin's resourcefulness, contributes to the carnival-esque dimension of the stories, challenging the weight of power through a game that ridicules authority. Other anecdotes report geographical divergences. Some ballads place Robin in the forest of Barnesdale, others emphasize Sherwood. There are also variants where Robin's home would be in the vicinity of Loxley, now near Sheffield, while other texts link him to Wakefield. All these topographical details reflect the diversity of medieval sources. Each region claims to have housed a local Robin. The legend does not need absolute coherence, as it spreads through oral ballads and rewritten fragments, thereby embracing the diversity of contexts. While Robin's figure is typically English in its institutional framework, royal forest, sheriff, the kingdom's feudal hierarchy, continental echoes recall its form. Tales of generous outlaws circulate in various European traditions, where they adopt different names and clash with other types of power. The French charivaris, a kind of parodic procession mocking the notables, or the wild carnival days in Italy, sketch the same festive protest impulse in the background. In certain regions of Lower Saxony, the Germanic heritage has sometimes called up a character named Rabun Hude, whose name and behavior strikingly recall Robin Hood. Although a direct link is not always proven by historians, these similarities suggest a circulation of literary motifs throughout medieval Europe, if not a common need for rebellious and mischievous figures in the service of the people. Among the oldest ballads found, Robin Hood and the Monk presents a specific confrontation between the outlaw and an influential monk. The story, probably originating from the 14th century, according to some scholars, illustrates the ambient animosity between those who perceive the church as an oppressive force and a part of the clergy, who, for its part, considers the bandit as an enemy of order. In this version, Robin is captured by the royal guards after being betrayed by the monk, then freed in extremis by Little John. The particular interest of Robin Hood and the monk lies in the fact that it somewhat deviates from the later stories centered on the forest and redistribution. Here we see a rougher hero, more prone to violence, which attests to the diversity of characters attributed to Robin before tradition settled around a more chivalrous portrait. In Scotland, the popularity of such tales led to variations, sometimes with refrains unique to the local oral tradition. The borders between England and Scotland were regularly disputed, and it's likely that some Scottish clans integrated the myth to demonstrate their hostility towards the English administration while embracing the appeal of the vigilante. Thus, the figure of Robin passed from one side of the border to the other, adapting to the aspirations of groups who saw themselves as dominated. Some motifs, like the traitorous monk, were easily transposable to designate religious or political authorities seen as complicit with the oppressor. Lower Saxony on the continent presents even more surprising analogies through the name Rabun Hude, or even Rabun Hada in some ancient dialects. Few sources allow us to trace a direct link with England, but oral tales collected from the 19th century suggest a local tradition of outlaws, jokingly mocked by official narratives, but beloved by the peasantry. It's possible that the popularity of the Robin Hood cycle, which is known to have circulated through merchants, soldiers, and minstrels, inspired a version adapted to Germanic realities. These tales sometimes mention characters equivalent to Little John or Much, indicating that the narrative structure had exported through informal channels. The common points between Robin Hood and the monk and the figure of Rabun Hude highlight a shared desire to believe in a bandit vigilante capable of ridiculing clerical and feudal injustice. The possibility of cross-influence between the Robin Hood cycle and other epics outside Europe has long fascinated some Orientalists and medievalists. Among the hypotheses put forward is the comparison with the Surat Antar, a collection of medieval Arabic tales centered on the character Antar ibn Shaddad, a Bedouin knight from a 7th century tribe. Antar is praised for his bravery, poetry, and acute sense of justice, although he grew up in ambiguous status, being the offspring of a noble father and a slave mother. The tales often describe him facing injustices, which he corrects with his strength and words. He defends the weak and embodies a certain nobility of soul outside traditional power. Some emphasize the similarities between Antar and Robin in terms of living partially outside of established norms, opposing injustice in the name of a personal code of honor, and being celebrated by oral tradition. However, the contexts remain obviously very different. Antar acts in a pre-Islamic tribal world, marked by clan rivalries and a code of honor, while Robin evolves in the midst of English feudalism, confronted with the monarchical apparatus and the power of the church. The commercial and cultural exchanges in the Mediterranean, intensified in the era of the Crusades, could, however, have favored the diffusion of literary motifs. We know that the multitude of stories brought back by merchants and pilgrims resonated in taverns and among minstrels seeking exoticism. Philological analyses have not established any certain direct lineage, but the proximity of themes, such as the outlaw hero, sung poetry, and the reversal of warrior codes in defense of the oppressed, are intriguing enough to suggest a permeability of imaginations. The troubadours of Occitan or Old French, in contact with travelers, might have drawn from these stories elements of adventure and magnified bravery. Similarly, mercenaries or sailors could have relayed epic romantic tales from the Near East in ports. While it cannot be formally proven that Surat Antar influenced Robin Hood, the comparison illuminates the existence of common archetypes: the marginal justice seeker, the celebration through ballads or poetry, and the allure of the marvelous combined with social critique. This conjunction of elements enriches the theme of the good outlaw embodied by Robin on the European scene. The last significant element concerning the dissemination and transformation of the legend lies in popular festivities which, under various latitudes, replay the spirit of playful rebellion associated with Robin. In France, charivaris are often cited, long burlesque processions organized on the occasion of weddings deemed unsuitable or to mock a local authority. Although the charivari is not directly an outlaw narrative, it conveys the same logic of inversion of power. The weak claim the right to jeer at the strong, through songs, disguises, and the clamor of pots and pans. Historians thus highlight the parallel. In both cases, a community expresses, through a festive ritual, its desire to correct a situation deemed abusively constraining or unjust. The customs of French villages in the medieval period, particularly in the Southwest, also included spring masquerades where a May King was crowned, an individual chosen to rule temporarily in a grotesque and satirical spirit. Even if the figure of Robin Hood does not always explicitly appear, the idea of redistribution and inversion is clearly manifested. In the United States, the tradition of May Day, the 1st of May celebration, has been nourished by various European sources, among which is the English heritage of May Games. In medieval England, indeed, the month of May was marked by great festivities where a Queen of May, and sometimes a King of May, were symbolically invested with a springtime aura. The assimilation of Maid Marian into May celebrations suggests a direct link with these rites of renewal and fertility. British colonists transplanted some of these practices onto American soil, although tinged with Protestantism and sometimes suspicion of rites considered too pagan. Gradually, American May Day became a day of picnics, dancing around the maypole, and spring celebrations. Despite the changes, the spirit of temporary reversal, the freedom to enjoy oneself outside the usual constraints, persists. At the turn of the 13th century, England found itself at a crossroads in its history. The successive reigns of Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and John Lackland profoundly reshaped the political and social landscape of the kingdom. Major judicial reforms, increased tax levies to finance wars or ransoms, and the difficult relationship between the crown and the nobility created fertile ground for the emergence of semi-legendary figures, of which Robin Hood is arguably the most illustrious representative. Yet, behind the aura of this outlaw who became the champion of the dispossessed, the question remains, did Robin Hood really exist? Over time, scholars, historians, and folklorists have embarked on a vast investigation to spot any trace in the archives that could identify him. Perfectly ordinary names, like Robert Hod, transform into possible sources of the myth, while other characters, closer to the social profile of a noble outlaw, enrich the discussion. Historians then invite us to be cautious. The figure of Robin could well be an amalgam of multiple rebels whose exploits have merged into popular memory. To understand them, one must dive into medieval reality and dissect the scattered clues in the rare documents of the period, from prosopography to comparative analysis of chronicles. The late walks and tales of Robin Hood generally insist on a precise geographical anchoring. Locksley, County of Yorkshire, sometimes spelled Locksley. In some versions, Robin is even declared Robert of Locksley, a young man supposedly dispossessed of his lands before seeking refuge in the forest. However, this location has immediately posed a methodological problem. Locksley can refer to several different places, including the one near Sheffield in South Yorkshire, or other Locksleys scattered elsewhere. Moreover, the use of a geographical nickname does not necessarily imply that the person concerned is noble. Many individuals bore the name of their village of origin, regardless of their position, to be distinguished in the records. Thus, when one scrutinizes the rare mentions of Robert of Locksley in the parish documents, the Pipe Rolls fiscal registers, or the manorial archives, it proves difficult to untangle the multiple Roberts, Rogers, or even Williams, as these first names are frequent at the time. One of the oldest tangible references to a Robert Hod appears in the Pipe Rolls of 1203, that is, under the reign of King John. This fiscal document lists various taxpayers and sometimes indicates their debts or offenses. Among these inscriptions, one discovers a certain Robert Hod, or Habahad, indebted to the royal treasury. The sum in question is modest, but the interest mainly comes from the phonetic proximity between Hod and Hood, which has sparked great speculation in historical research. Moreover, this reference does not appear in Nottinghamshire, but in Wakefield, in West Yorkshire. Wakefield draws its importance from its status as a somewhat dynamic rural borough and its proximity to several forests, not only Sherwood, but also Barnesdale, another hotspot of outlaw tradition. This unique mention, however, is not enough to prove that this Robert Hod was the famous Robin, especially since the documents remain silent regarding any criminal activities or forest wandering. Yet, his case has fascinated historians as it chronologically corresponds to the period where Robin Hood is situated, around the very beginning of the 13th century, when social tensions were intensifying under King John. Numerous researchers also recount the story of Roger Godbird, a forester, that is, a forest keeper turned outlaw in the 1260s. Roger Godbird appears in contemporary accounts as a rebel who took up arms against the regency governing in the absence of King Henry III, or later against the supporters of Edward III. In 1267, he is reported in Sherwood Forest, where he engages in acts of brigandage, cattle theft, or attacks against the king's representatives. The chronicles mention his entourage composed of other outlaws who, like him, grouped together to exploit the vast forest area, which was difficult for county authorities to control. In some analyses, Godbird's story is compared to several classic scenes in Robin Hood ballads: resistance to officialdom, confrontation with sheriffs, complicity with some local peasants. Yet, a few decades separate Godbird's supposed exploits from the first mention of Robin Hood in literature. Specialists therefore insist once again on caution. It is possible that actions committed by other outlaws were attributed to Robin Hood simply because his stories progressively enriched with all the sensational exploits that circulated as public rumors. If one is looking for a truly noble character, capable of supporting the versions where Robin Hood is from the gentry or a dispossessed noble family, one comes across the figure of Fulk Fitzwarren. Born around the late 12th century and hailing from a line of barons with holdings on the Welsh marches, Fulk found himself in direct conflict with King John shortly after the latter's accession to the throne in 1199. The reasons for discord were multiple: family rivalries, confiscation of lands, and, according to some accounts, a possible personal disagreement between Fulk and the young Prince John before his coronation. When the new sovereign confirmed his vengeance and punished Fulk, the latter openly rebelled, leaving the royal lands to hide in the wooded lands and border hills. According to some chronicles, Fulk and his followers then lived on the fringes of authority, attacking tax collectors, redistributing part of their gains to the local population, and garnering some sympathy in the regions neglected by the king. The analogies with the Robin Hood legend are striking. A dispossessed noble who uses his skills and sense of chivalry to serve the less fortunate while becoming the #1 enemy of the crown. The tales of Fulk Fitzwarren bear hints of our popular ballads, but there is no evidence to date that he was named or nicknamed Robin Hood. Nevertheless, he remains one of the most frequently cited examples to illustrate how the exploits of a rebellious baron can merge into the myth of the Archer of Sherwood. These different individuals are not the only ones considered by research. Medieval England, particularly the turbulent period surrounding the reigns of Richard and John, produced a whole series of outlaws, dispossessed minor lords, or simple commoners who fell out of favor. In this climate, having a name similar to Robin Hood or committing acts of banditry in a royal forest was enough to fuel rumors. Prosopography, the method of collectively studying the lives of individuals mentioned in various documents, has partially reconstructed the existence of these Robert, Roger, or folk figures. Their feats of arms are compared, their dates of activity, their conflicts with royal power, and we see that several trajectories overlap. Thus, an outlaw listed in Derbyshire could have met a rebel from Lincolnshire, or conversely, an act noted in the manorial archives of Yorkshire might prove to be the same event as the one recounted in a court report from Nottinghamshire. The challenge lies in the fact that surnames change, distort, and sometimes disappear. The records might indicate Robert Hood one day and Robin Hood the next month, without being able to confirm it's the same person. Scribes of the time did not hesitate to abbreviate, spell according to their own usage, or simply use a nickname. The historiographical debate largely crystallized in the 20th century when British scholars attempted to apply more systematic methods of analysis. Among them, J.C. Holt remains a leading figure. In his landmark work dedicated to Robin Hood, he brought together a corpus of ballads, fiscal documents, charters, and other administrative pieces to develop coherent hypotheses about the hero's identity. Holt leaned towards the idea that no single candidate perfectly matched the profile of the legendary Robin Hood. For him, tradition acted like a sieve, gathering various exploits of outlaws, real or exaggerated, and fusing them into the figure of an elusive archer. This process, which he sometimes calls legendary aggregation, occurs over several decades, even centuries. Earlier, historians had already hypothesized a multiple origin of the legend, but Holt's rigor provided a more solid argument, supported by a meticulous exploration of the sources. Stephen Knight, another major specialist, continued these reflections by emphasizing the literary and popular nature of medieval ballads. According to Knight, the important thing is not so much to prove the existence of a real Robin Hood, but to understand how the character could spread so quickly and widely in English culture. In his view, the figure of Robin embodies a social need for a counter-model to royal power, a vigilante on the fringe, whose legitimacy rests not on the laws of the kingdom, but on a communal morality. Knight and other researchers stress that the legend thrived in a world where excessive taxation, strong social hierarchy, and the arbitrary nature of some lords engendered a strong desire for an avenging hero, a symbol of equality and justice. Therefore, the question of Robin's true identity takes a back seat. Whether he was a peasant from Wakefield, a baron from the Welsh marches, or a simple individual whose name has been lost, the legendary archer is mainly a point of crystallization of the popular aspiration for equity. Other historians have studied the spelling variations of the name Robin Hood. They noticed that, as early as the 14th century, this nickname, or its derivatives, Robhod, Robin Hood, Robhud, often appeared to denote criminals in certain regions of England. It even happens that judicial documents use the expression a Robin Hood as a synonym for outlaw, somewhat like an archetype. This banalization may result from the popularity of ballads and folklore. A masked bandit would sometimes proclaim himself Robin Hood, or be dubbed with this nickname by the amused or admiring population. Such cases make it even more complex to locate a real Robin, since by the end of the Middle Ages, the name was no longer unique. It became a label for rebels, a nod to all who openly defied authority. All these elements lead to the idea of facing a composite character. The legend of Robin Hood seems to have united, over time, various stories of anti-tax resistance, dispossessed nobles, skillful yeomen, and foresters in dispute with royal administration. Troubadours and minstrels, singing in fairs and villages, would seize these stories to amplify them. a poorly identified rebel from Yorkshire could be equated with a rebellious baron from the Welsh borders, all merging into the enchanting setting of Sherwood. The medieval public, fond of edifying or entertaining stories, would thrill at the exploits of this larger-than-life hero who managed to mock the incompetence of a sheriff or the greed of a tax collector. Without large-scale printing, the circulation of these legends relied on oral transmission. Stories were transformed and rewritten to fit each audience, each region. Thus, typical motifs, the quarterstaff duel, the archery contest, the redistribution of stolen goods, gradually fixed into a canonical framework, while the central character asserted itself under a stable name, Robin Hood. One might then wonder, why did medieval English society between the 12th and 14th centuries need a heroic figure of this kind? Researchers generally answer by mentioning the fiscal pressure and legal insecurity weighing on small tenants, as well as some disgraced lords. Oppressed by a rigid feudal system, these groups felt strong frustration towards power, creating an imaginative ground to magnify anyone willing to defy the crown or administration. The countryside inhabitants often endured the harshness of the forest laws, the laws on hunting and managing wooded masses, reserved for the king, which criminalized the slightest intrusion or game capture. In this context, the skilled, cunning outlaw close to the people almost represented an acceptable counterlaw driven by a moral ideal. One steals goods or game, but redistributes to the poor. One mocks the sheriff, but respects a tacit code of honor defined by the community. The ballads precisely highlight this gap with official legality. Robin is not an ordinary bandit, drunk on violence and looting. He is a rectifier of injustices, embodying the outside law that stands as judge against the abuses of the powerful. This social function partly explains the myth's tenacity, its success among all population layers, and later in more scholarly literature. On the precise question of true identity, most contemporary studies prefer to speak of a plurality of real models rather than a single individual. On one side, there's the hypothesis of a Robert Hod, whose name appears in a tax register around 1203, or that of a certain Robin Hood mentioned as an outlaw in 1225, sometimes in Yorkshire, sometimes in Berkshire. On the other side, there's Roger Godberd, active in the 1260s, 1270s, or even Fulk Fitzwarren, a rebellious noble figure in the early reign of John Lackland. None of these protagonists alone offers a complete portrait of the hero. Some legendary figures like Fulk bring us closer to the noble birth that some versions accord to Robin. Others, like the simple commoner Robert Hod, more closely resemble the popular profile of an ordinary man forced into hiding. The intertwining of these influences is reinforced by oral tradition that, through minstrels, embellishes the adventures and adds literary innovations such as whimsical encounters or impossible archery duels. It is in this perspective that the critical conclusion advocated by many historians finally appears. Robin Hood could very well be the synthesis of multiple collective memories, overlaid with the moral and symbolic necessity of an outlaw justice seeker. The medieval society, lacking institutional intermediaries to correct injustices, might have needed a sort of reparative legend, embodied by a man with exceptional archery skills and exemplary generosity. The late sources, ballads, and plays would thus have captured scattered stories to inject them into a unified framework, that of the big-hearted bandit who caps each of his feats with an archery exploit. The very conditions of preservation of scattered, sometimes incomplete documents, or those written with political intentions, make it nearly impossible to provide formal proof of the existence of a single and unique Robin. but they neither completely contradict the possibility that a man of this name, or one approaching it, could have conducted some notable actions before falling into the oblivion of chronicles. Manuscripts like the famous A Gest of Robin Hood, probably composed in the 15th century, hint at a backdrop shaped by later stories, where ballads integrate traces of episodes possibly dated to the 14th or even the 13th century, thus accumulating anachronisms. We find traces of the arch-enemy, the Sheriff of Nottingham, who embodies the oppressive force of the feudal state. The often-mentioned protection of King Richard the Lionheart, absent but fair, refers to the ideal of a distant and merciful sovereign in the face of corrupt officers. These elements, repeated and transformed over multiple rewrites, reinforce the idea of a legendary mosaic. Additionally, some researchers point to the progressive evolution of Robin's figure from a simple skilled thief to a courtly knight, hand on heart and with an almost chivalrous conscience. In this line, Robin is more akin to a founding myth, carrying idealized values than a precise historical memory. However, there are also details in the stories that do not correspond to pure invention. For example, the precise knowledge of certain toponyms or the mention of actual forest customs, such as the strict prohibition of hunting deer reserved for the crown. Times of crisis or political instability, the 12th and 13th centuries saw the birth of many frustrations among the peasantry and the lesser nobility. The forests, so politically significant for the Plantagenet kings, constituted areas of refuge or latent revolt. Archaeological excavations and studies conducted in the Sherwood region show that it was not simply a dense and unusual wood, but a varied natural space, including cultivated clearings and easily concealable pathways conducive to ambushes and illegal gatherings. The legends of forest bandits are therefore rooted in a concrete reality. Any place at the margins of authority, difficult to control, could create a hero or a villain, depending on the viewpoint adopted. The royal forests, protected by rigorous sheriffs and a draconian legislative ensemble, were potential hotbeds of daily confrontations. J.C. Holt, Stephen Knight, along with other authors like R.B. Dobson or Louise Sylvester, invite the modern reader to envision the fluidity of medieval identity. Individuals did not possess easily accessible identity cards or birth certificates. Their nicknames could change based on significant events, a tavern joke, or a physical detail. Over time, those who hid in the woods could disappear from official listings and reappear under an alias. On a literary level, these changes continued to fuel the legendary machine, resulting in variations where Robin is sometimes named Robahod or is assisted by another outlaw nicknamed Little John, Will Scarlet, or Much the Miller's Son. The multiplicity of nicknames, the absence of unified documents, and the role of oral tradition make it nearly impossible to reach any definitive conclusion about the existence of a single individual. The borderline character that Robin Hood represents is positioned precisely between the foundational myth and archival memories, simultaneously embodies a reflection of the real tensions experienced by medieval society and a symbolic narrative that survives through the centuries. The archives hint at real protagonists, small bandits, or rebellious barons who confronted royal authority and, sometimes unwittingly, became figures of justice or freedom in the eyes of local populations. The myth gradually aggregates all these attributes to forge the image of a universal vigilante, adapted to feudal England and later to multiple European literary reinterpretations. Many researchers believe that originally, this hero embodied the revolt against tax abuses and the seigneurial system. Then, with the evolution of mentalities, he became an archetype, a symbol that even transcends England's borders, carried by translations, chansons de geste, and stage rewritings. The argument that a single man named Robert or Robin could have led all these adventures is confronted by the logic of fragmentary sources. As for the desire to bestow Fulk Fitzwarren, Roger Godbird, or Robert Hod with the prestige of the legend, it is challenged by the chronological and factual divergences of existing accounts. The moral need of society intervenes in the formation of the mythons in a context where horizontal solidarity was one of the only bulwarks against injustices. People could only exalt the epic of an altruistic outlaw. Major medieval epics continuously recounted exploits, inviting the public to admire the courage and cunning of heroes marginalized by the established order. Parallels even appear with other cultures, where we find figures of vigilantes punishing the wealthy or redistributing resources. In the Arab world, for instance, the tales around Antar also celebrate the bravery of a solitary hero defending a moral ideal, although the contexts and cultures differ greatly. The motivations that led storytellers and monastic chroniclers to glorify a character like Robin Hood also relate to Christian mythology, and in some versions, Robin is perceived as a defender of the Virgin Mary, sometimes akin to the Marian figure battling injustice and tyranny. There is a religious framework grafted onto the theme of the vigilante. This Christianization of the legend may have helped reinforce popular adherence in the Middle Ages, where religious consciousness was an integral part of daily life. Outlaws who were too violent or lacking in moral values did not pass into posterity. Robin, on the contrary, benefits from a pious veneer. His generosity is described, his respect towards his comrades or certain just authorities, the ideal king in this case, Richard, as well as his protective attitude towards the humble. Historians have long wondered if, through this lens of popular piety, anachronistic elements had been introduced into a much older narrative already laden with colorful adventures. One can see in the construction of the figure of Robin Hood a phenomenon similar to the birth of other founding myths like King Arthur, a murky and fragmentary past where historical episodes slip in, embellished with numerous literary and folkloric additions, giving rise to a hero embodying a whole series of social, political, and religious values. In this regard, the question is no longer limited to whether Robin lived in the early 13th century or towards the end of the 12th, whether he was a knight or a peasant, but rather to understand how and why he became an emblematic banner taken up in popular traditions and later in Elizabethan theater and romantic literature. At the end of this analysis, the figure of Robin stands at the boundary between a founding myth and historical fact. The rare documentary evidence is too tenuous or too tedious to interpret to ascertain his identity with certainty, while the symbolic importance the character has acquired in English and international culture testifies to the strength of a legend promoted by ballads and the collective imagination. The multiple prosopographical leads of Robert Hod of Wakefield, Roger Godbird, Fulk Fitzwarren, and even several Robert of Locksley figures scattered throughout Yorkshire sometimes intersect, often contradict each other, and suggest that behind the name Robin Hood hides a bundle of stories, perhaps originating from partial realities, magnified by the art of popular storytelling. The great historians of the 20th century, such as J.C. Holt and Stephen Knight, have agreed on the hypothesis of an aggregate of exploits, a puzzle assembled by medieval England to breathe life into a benevolent hero capable of challenging the systemic injustice inherent in feudal structures. The legacy of this composite figure is still evident in how Robin Hood is leveraged, revisited, and reinvented over the ages. Archive sources, although rare, make plausible the existence of outlaws named Robahad or Robin Hood at various times, while literary, religious, and political elements prove that the narrative was nourished by diverse and successive contributions. Document after document, the same pattern is found: a criminal denounced by the authorities, a local population that sometimes admires them, a climate of fiscal oppression, and in the background, the great English forests. In such a setting, any rebel skillful enough to evade the king's sergeants could one day or another be identified, rightly or wrongly, as a Robin Hood. The ballads, popularized by the troubadours, collected this collective fantasy and gave it a unique, endearing, unifying face. This symbiosis between news items, oral narratives, and social needs likely explains the resilience of the character in the Western imagination. By the 14th century, the character of Robin Hood was already beginning to circulate in popular ballads and find a place in various types of narratives in England. He is sometimes mentioned in moral plays or in writings not necessarily devoted to his adventures, but where his name symbolizes a form of marginal bravery. At the time, medieval literature was largely transmitted orally, and each troubadour or minstrel could embroider new episodes around this hero. Yet, these mentions are often fleeting or partial, and the legend still merges with other outlaw stories. It does not yet have the solid narrative structure that will emerge later, particularly in the Elizabethan era. The rare ancient manuscripts explicitly mentioning Robin Hood often emphasize his aspect as a vigilante seeking to redistribute certain wealth, rather than the heroic or romantic details that will later characterize the plays and adaptations of the Renaissance and modern era. During the 15th century, in a rapidly changing England, the figure of the noble outlaw gained momentum. The turmoil of the Wars of the Roses, 1455, 1485, and the emergence of new dynasties contributed to creating a climate ripe for the mythification of characters capable of standing against injustice. Successive monarchs, like Edward IV or Henry VII, attempted to consolidate their power, while rebellious figures popularized in fairs or local festivals continued to grow in fame. Robin Hood, associated with Sherwood Forest, increasingly penetrated popular culture through May games and traveling performances. The English saw in him a symbol of hope, embodying the rebellious spirit of the people against the abuses of the lords. It was through these festive representations, often associated with the celebration of spring and the rebirth of nature, that the bravery of the noble bandit was reiterated before more detailed documents appeared in the following decades. In the 16th century, during the reign of Henry VIII, then Edward II, and finally Elizabeth III, England underwent significant religious reforms. The theatrical culture experienced spectacular growth, especially after the creation of professional troupes and the opening of permanent theaters in London. The political climate, interwoven with religious tensions and Queen Elizabeth's desire to solidify English identity, favored the staging of characters drawn from national folklore. Robin Hood then gradually transformed into a character apt to entertain a broad audience. Playwrights were passionate about these popular heroes, capable of uniting the population around a sense of cultural cohesion. Although Shakespeare did not dedicate an entire play to him, some Elizabethan dialogues contain allusions to the outlaws of Sherwood Forest. Gradually, Robin began to acquire a more romantic aura, marked by the ideal of courtly love and a certain gaiety that contrasted with the harshness of his medieval origins. The true breakthrough of Robin Hood on the theatrical scene occurred, however, at the end of the 16th century and the turn of the 17th. In 1598, Anthony Munday, an Elizabethan playwright, proposed two particularly influential plays, The Downfall of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, and The Death of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon. In these works, he portrayed Robin as a fallen noble, the Earl of Huntingdon, forced to take refuge in the forest. The playwright anchored the story in a slightly more aristocratic reality than the old ballads. Robin was no longer just a rebellious peasant, but a noble unjustly stripped of his title. This gave his adventures a tragic, even melancholic dimension. Munday also inserted new elements, notably the love story with Marian, which became increasingly central, and a chivalric dimension that flattered the depiction of nobility on stage. The success of these plays helped give Robin Hood an additional veneer, more romantic and more acceptable to the cultured audience of London theaters. The 17th century marked a period during which the legend continued to circulate, albeit subject to the great upheavals of England at the time, the reign of James I, conflicts between the Crown and Parliament, the English Civil War 1642 to 1651, and the Commonwealth of Cromwell. Theatre faced bans several times, especially under Cromwell, but the popular fervor for the old tales did not fade. In the countryside, the memory of Robin was preserved through local entertainments and literary references, occasionally dotted the pamphlet production or satirical writings, where his name was used to symbolize a form of resistance to tyrannical authority. Few major new plays were born, but this character remained in the cultural substratum, ready to resurface in new forms as the political climate relaxed and the performing arts regained momentum during the Restoration and the subsequent period. The 18th century in England is a time of enlightenment and intense development of the press and publishing, supported by an increasingly powerful bourgeoisie. The ballads of Robin Hood continue to be printed, and his name is sometimes embellished with pseudo-historical anecdotes intended to pique the curiosity of a readership eager for tales and patriotic stories. In these texts, the hero is often imbued with a spirit of freedom, at a time when enlightened discussions on rights and the distribution of power are raging. The scholarly rankings of the time, notably those of antiquarians who strive to catalog and analyze all sources of the past, gradually group the ballads around a more unified figure. Robin Hood is then presented as a picturesque element of national identity, somewhere between historical reality and poetic tradition. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Romantic movement overturned the way people viewed the past. Writers and historians, seeking to recapture the soul of distant eras, heavily valorized the Middle Ages, perceived as an era of chivalry and passionate emotions. In 1819, Walter Scott, one of the fathers of English historical literature, published Ivanhoe. This novel, set in the 12th century, features a whole gallery of medieval characters and introduces a Robin Hood under the identity of Locksley. Although he is not the main hero of the work, he proves to be a valuable ally, both a Saxon patriot and a champion of justice in an England dominated by oppressive Normans. Walter Scott helps anchor the image of a Robin Hood who protects the humble in the collective imagination. He sparks a wave of enthusiasm for literary and theatrical adaptations, where emphasis is placed on the patriotic side and English national pride in the face of past invasions. The success of Ivanhoe is considerable, fueling a patriotic reinterpretation of the Middle Ages and endowing Robin with a romantic aura associated with honor, bravery, and loyalty to a higher principle of justice. Following the publication of Ivanhoe, numerous plays are produced across the United Kingdom, reviving the exploits of Robin Hood on stage, and even sometimes transforming certain episodes. Spectators flock in large numbers to admire iconic scenes, such as the archery tournament or the encounter with the sheriff. On the literary front, collections of ballads, often accompanied by scholarly commentary, emerge. The character gradually acquires a veneer of great elegance, influenced by Romanticism, emphasizing his respect for nature, his quest for a moral ideal, and his sincere love for Marion. This romantic movement, which extends across Europe, also results in translations into various languages, allowing Robin Hood to settle into the imagination of readers in France, Germany, or even Russia. Meanwhile, the 19th century, especially its second half, is the age of the Industrial Revolution and undeniable social upheavals. In some emerging political circles linked to socialism or the defense of workers, Robin Hood becomes a standard bearer of economic justice. Worker communes and mutualist movements appear everywhere. For many socialist activists, the legend of Robin, who takes from the rich to give to the poor, is perceived as the materialization of an ideal of redistribution and solidarity. Worker pamphlets highlight fiscal injustice, as well as the necessity of rebalancing relations between social classes, and the name of Robin Hood is then brandished as the iconic symbol of the people's champion. In some discourses, the aristocratic character given to him by Munday or other writers is omitted to focus almost exclusively on the overturning of privileges and the defense of the poor. This appropriation reinforces the identification of Robin Hood with protest, such that the figure continues to circulate in Europe in various activist milieus. With the advent of the 20th century, the legend definitively took off internationally, thanks to the new mass media, cinema. The first known silent adaptation dates back to 1908, but it was in 1922 that Douglas Fairbanks portrayed a memorable Robin Hood in one of the great successes of the silent film era. The film featured gigantic sets for the time and made Fairbanks' archer silhouette an icon. Spectacular, this production introduced in the collective imagery a heroic, agile, leaping Robin who combined chivalric faith with a penchant for fun. In the United States and Europe, the audience became passionate about these sword fights, these rides through the forest, and the humor conveyed by the charming outlaw. The commercial triumph of Fairbanks' film marked a turning point. Robin Hood became a movie star, and his story quickly crossed borders in the context where silent movies were easily exportable. In 1938, Warner Brothers released The Adventures of Robin Hood, with Errol Flynn in the lead role and Olivia de Havilland as Lady Marion. Directed by Michael Curtis and William Keighley, this Technicolor film is a gem of Hollywood's golden age, mixing action, humor, and romance in a meticulous production. Errol Flynn, with his charisma and sword-wielding skills, indelibly marked the representation of Robin Hood. He embodied a laughing, carefree hero, but fiercely attached to justice, while Basil Rathbone, as Sir Guy of Gisborne, provided an elegant and brutal antagonist. The epic music, the colorful sets, and the cloak and dagger scenes crystallized the vision of an idealized Middle Ages. For many viewers around the world, Sherwood Forest has since taken on the warm colors of Technicolor, and Robin Hood bears the mischievous face of Errol Flynn. After World War II, many adaptations emerged, both on screens and on television. British series such as The Adventures of Robin Hood, produced by ITV in the 1950s, with Richard Green in the title role, were later exported to the United States. The values of bravery and justice carried by the character resonated well with the post-war climate, where there was a desire to revive a moral ideal and to find diversion from difficult years. Producers also exploited the pleasure of an exotic medieval depiction, and the image of the archer in a green tunic became an immediately recognizable distinctive mark, even for those who have never opened a single historical ballad. In 1973, Disney produced an animated film, Robin Hood, which transposed the characters into anthropomorphic animals. Robin is a sly fox, Little John a friendly bear, and the Sheriff of Nottingham a wolf. This approach gave the story an even more accessible character for children while retaining the essence of the plot. Robin steals gold to redistribute it to the needy, confronts Prince John, depicted as a greedy lion, and shows cunning in every adventure. This version marked several generations thanks to its catchy songs and colorful universe. Many children of the time discovered the legend through this medium, developing a deep attachment to the idea of a clever fox fighting against injustice. Over time, this film has become a classic of the Disney catalog, ensuring the continued diffusion of the myth to an international and very young audience. At the end of the 20th century, the Hollywood industry revisited the myth once again. In 1991, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves was released, directed by Kevin Reynolds, with Kevin Costner in the lead role and Alan Rickman as the Sheriff of Nottingham. The film is meant to be darker in certain respects, emphasizing the brutality of the ruling power, corruption, and the people's misery. The sheriff appears particularly cruel, while Morgan Freeman plays Azim, a companion from the East, signaling an intention to give the story a certain multicultural dimension. Despite anachronisms, the work enjoyed colossal success at the box office and helped revive enthusiasm for the legend. The title song, performed by Bryan Adams, "Everything I Do It For You," became an international hit. Robin Hood again became a dominant hero on the media scene, popularized by an international blockbuster. At the same time, director Mel Brooks offered a quirky parody in 1993, Robin Hood, Men in Tights, known in France as Sacré Robin des Bois, with Carrie Elwes playing a mischievous Robin. The film gently mocks the stereotypes of the legend, poking fun at the lavish costumes, romantic cliches, and the actors' varying accents. The success of this parody proves that the myth has become a culturally stable figure in the collective imagination, capable of supporting or even encouraging mockery. Every viewer knows enough of the story's outlines to appreciate the comedic twists. This approach, in line with the American burlesque tradition, confirms how universally recognizable Robin Hood has become, even in a humorous version. At the start of the 21st century, studios did not tire of revisiting the legend. In 2010, Ridley Scott directed Robin Hood with Russell Crowe and Cate Blanchett. The film presents a supposedly more realistic retelling, rooted in the historical context of the late 12th century, where the English monarchy must deal with the ambitions of King Philip II of France and internal rivalries. Russell Crowe plays a more taciturn Robin, a former English army archer, fighting against injustice while striving to maintain authenticity in the setting and costumes. However, this adaptation, despite a significant budget and a prestigious cast, received mixed reactions. Some admired the darker atmosphere and efforts to depict a less romanticized Middle Ages, while others lamented the absence of the fantasy and humor traditionally associated with the outlaw of Sherwood. In 2018, a new version simply titled Robin Hood was directed by Otto Bathurst, featuring Taron Egerton, Jamie Foxx, and Ben Mendelsohn. This adaptation aims to be dynamic, adopting a style similar to modern action films, with highly choreographed combat scenes. Critics and audiences are divided. Some see it as unpretentious entertainment, while others criticize the narrative for straying too far from the original spirit. Nevertheless, the production attests to the enduring interest in this age-old hero, whose name instantly evokes archery, the forest, and redistribution of wealth. Studios seem confident in the potential of a universe that allows for adventure, romance, and values of fairness. Comics, too, have included Robin Hood in their catalogs, whether in English, American, French, or Italian publications. As early as the 1940s, comics in the United States presented the hero in more or less faithful forms. Publishers like Quality Comics or Magazine Enterprises offered episodic adventures where Robin Hood faced nearly fantastic enemies. Over the decades, various artists have envisioned darker or more humorous approaches. Some authors reimagine Robin as a science fiction hero placed in a different setting, or even as a costumed superheroic vigilante. Each time, the story's basics, the bow, the forest, the noble spirit, remain, confirming the flexibility of the legend. Comic book enthusiasts find a multiplicity of tones and styles, proving that the myth remains flexible enough to adapt to all genres. Throughout these representations, a common thread emerges: Robin Hood's ability to symbolize a form of social justice or even political advocacy. Already in the 19th century, as seen, he became a reference within socialist circles, ideally illustrating the notion that inequalities could be addressed at the root by challenging the financial power of the wealthy. In the 20th century, the same figure was sometimes co-opted by libertarian movements who saw in him an individualist vigilante against state oppression, embodied by the corrupt sheriff. In some narratives, Robin Hood is no longer just a bearer of a collective ideal, but an example of resistance to all forms of tyranny or monopoly of authority. The legend lends itself to multiple political interpretations depending on the chosen angle, with its popularity stemming from its sufficiently flexible nature to encompass various social struggles. During the second half of the 20th century, and even more so in the 21st century, ecological awareness has developed strongly. Organizations and activists have used the Robin Hood imagery to emphasize the protection of forests and wildlife, highlighting the importance of harmony between humans and nature. Sherwood Forest, once just a refuge for outlaws in medieval imagination, has transformed into a symbol of environmental balance. Advocates of radical ecology willingly highlight the idea of Robin as a protector of trees and biodiversity, the opposite of the greedy civilization that raises and pillages resources. At environmentalist demonstrations, you may see signs or banners depicting a green-clad archer, asserting that Robin Hood would not have tolerated deforestation, or that he would fight for the planet if his story were set in the 21st century. This green appropriation adds another layer to the ongoing evolution of the myth. What was once a critique of tax injustice becomes a plea for the preservation of natural spaces. In some countries, the reference to Robin Hood has even become institutionalized. For example, there is the Robin Hood tax, a proposed tax on financial transactions advocated by some politicians and associations to try to better distribute wealth. The idea of taking from wealthy banking establishments to fund social causes is in itself just a modern transposition of the notion of redistribution. The very use of Robin Hood's name illustrates how this legend blends into the contemporary political vocabulary and transforms into a quantified argument. The symbolism of a hero who redresses economic inequalities with a shot of his arrow continues to resonate in the collective imagination. In recent audiovisual culture, the B.B.4 Christ aired a series titled simply Robin Hood from 2006 to 2009, with Jonas Armstrong in the lead role. Partially filmed in Hungary for budget reasons, It infuses a modern TV series pace with youthful characters, dynamic fight choreography, and plot lines that sometimes flirt with soap opera. The sheriff is portrayed as a shrewd, calculating politician, primarily seeking to increase his power. The romantic dimension is even more pronounced, and the series explores the love triangle between Robin, Marion, and Guy of Gisborne. This version attracts a young audience, served by the modernity of the TV format and the density of the action. The B.B.4 Christ, aware of the marketing potential, capitalizes on the name to sell the series internationally, proving the myth's continually global resonance. In cinema, other more modest projects, sometimes independent, regularly emerge. Some directors choose to return to the roots by freely adapting the old ballads, while others propose offbeat universes, setting Robin in a post-apocalyptic England or in a world mixing fantasy and steampunk. The attraction to this medieval hero allows for all kinds of experimentation. On stage, musicals emerge. Robin Hood is sometimes performed as a family show with songs, equestrian numbers, and choreographed fights. Overall, the narrative matrix, opposing injustice, living in the forest, skillfully wielding a bow, remains the same, creating coherence, but each author has immense freedom to reshape the universe. The political symbolism, meanwhile, does not disappear. Thus, in the 20th century, after the Second World War, Labour, Communist, or far-left parties saw in Robin Hood the archetype of the revolutionary vigilante, sometimes attaching a Marxist discourse on class struggle to him. Libertarians, especially in the United States, have argued the opposite, that Robin Hood rebelled against the fiscal oppression of the feudal state, making him a champion of individual freedom. With the rise of ecological concerns, he has also become an eco-warrior ahead of his time, protecting Sherwood from destruction and living self-sufficiently. Each era, each political trend, draws from the myth the aspect most ideologically useful to it. From the Industrial Revolution to the present day, this is what explains why no party or school of thought can fully appropriate Robin Hood. He is at once a solitary rebel against the state, a defender of the poor, a friend to the trees, and, in some interpretations, even a staunch loyalist, protecting the legitimate power of a king unjustly dispossessed. This multiplicity of interpretations is also encouraged by academic environments and mass culture. On one hand, historians and literature professors take particular pleasure in dissecting and analyzing the successive appearances of Robin Hood in the imagination, studying his thematic shifts from one era to another. On the other hand, filmmakers and authors, aware of the universal appeal of the myth, regularly exploit technological advancements to renew public interest, transition to Technicolor, 3D, high definition, etc. The forest epic is also found in theme parks, video games where some offer quests in a recreated medieval England, or even in advertisements featuring a masked archer extolling the virtues of various products. In the 21st century, where there is a rapid acceleration of cultural globalization, Robin Hood appears in events gathering fans of heroic fantasy, in online forums discussing the social catechism of the legend, or in historical medieval reenactments organized throughout Europe and North America. At a festival, it is not uncommon to encounter groups dressed as archers, proudly displaying the insignia of a stag or the characteristic green hood. Reenactment communities, which sometimes strive to recreate the context of the 13th century, either depict a Robin still very much influenced by rudimentary means, or a romanticized outlaw embellished by late romantic tropes. The debates on the true version remain lively, but it is precisely this perpetual debate that keeps Robin Hood enthusiasts engaged. He has become a living dialogue space between tradition and reinvention. The most recent adaptations, whether they are big-screen projects announced for the 2020s or parallel series versions, attempt various angles. Sometimes they emphasize the origins, i.e., Robin's childhood as an archer or soldier, or the crudely political aspect of the tax revolt. Others focus on the romance between Robin and Marian, exploiting very contemporary codes of gender equality, making Marian a warrior or a strategist in her own right. Then there are attempts at medieval thrillers, where the character receives a more violent, even bloody treatment, reflecting the current attraction for realistic and brutal atmospheres inspired by the success of certain high-budget historical series. Thus, the legend completes its cycle. It constantly renews itself to reach a new audience each time in a world undergoing profound changes. In some non-English-speaking countries, the fascination remains just as alive. French schoolchildren timidly learn the story of Robin Hood through a synthesis of books or cartoons. Germans may discover the figure of Robin Hood as early as kindergarten in illustrated books. Italians know Disney's Fox, and the image of a green-clad man protecting the widow and the orphan speaks to the romantic minds of the entire European continent. In Latin America and Asia, the myth has been exported by Hollywood film productions, notably those featuring Errol Flynn. Here again, the idea of a dashing vigilante, synonymous with equality and adventure, is anchored in a lush forest that acts as an exotic Eden. At the same time, medieval festivals outside the United Kingdom often pay homage to the hero by inviting troops specialized in archery. In Japan, for example, some kyudo competitions, traditional Japanese archery, evoke the spirit of Robin Hood as a symbol of precision and honor. In contemporary Africa, the legend is also known, sometimes allegorically associated with the fight against governments deemed corrupt or mining companies appropriating natural resources. Local identifications continue to flourish, born from the character's plasticity and the ease with which anyone can make him the herald of social, political, or ecological resistance. Nowadays, even in the virtual realm, online groups call themselves the Robin Hood Army or Robin Hood Society, carrying out charitable actions aimed at redistributing food, clothing, or medicine to the most disadvantaged. The name is not innocent. It aims to highlight a moral kinship with the benefactor outlaw. Social networks greatly contribute to the rapid dissemination of these initiatives, which adopt the symbolism of the bow and the hood. Of course, these modern activities free themselves from traditional medieval imagery, but they retain the core idea, helping those who have nothing by easing the burden of inequality. The view of academics observes the global circulation of a myth with multiple facets, transitioning from medieval manuscripts and oral ballads to the vast echo chamber of cinema and the internet. The legend has become a mirror where each society recognizes itself through the lens of resistance, freedom, courtly love, or the protection of nature. Every time a new social movement emerges or a new technological invention appears, printing, photography, cinema, television streaming, Robin Hood finds a new medium to reappear, changed, modernized, while retaining its narrative core. An individual or group challenging an order declared illegitimate in the name of the deep-seated belief that justice deserves to be defended.